Welcome to the 7th Annual Speech Matters Conference, Truth, Trust, and Transformation, brought to you by the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. Today, we gather at a critical moment for higher education. Across the nation, the role of colleges and universities in our democracy is being questioned. Trust in institutions is shifting. The impact of a historic national election and a year of campus protests continues to unfold. In a world where truth is debated, trust is tested, and transformation is essential. How do we move forward? This year's Speech Matters Conference brings together leading legal minds, journalists, and higher ed leaders to tackle these challenges head-on. With 4 thought-provoking sessions and 15 distinguished speakers, we'll engage in candid conversations about free speech, misinformation, expertise, and the future of higher education. Now let's take a look at what's ahead. Session 1, Rebuilding Trust in Higher Education. Session 2, Co-Chairs in Conversation. Session 3, Disinformation and the Decline of Expertise. Session 4, Taking the Temperature of Campus Speech. So get ready to engage, get ready to challenge ideas, and get ready to be part of the conversation that will shape the future of free speech in higher education. Welcome to Speech Matters 2025, Truth, Trust, and Transformation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement's 7th Annual Speech Matters Conference. I'm Michelle Deutschman, the Center's Executive Director, and I'm excited that all of you are here for our half day of conversations about truth, trust, and transformation in higher education. Before we dive in, I just want to mention that if you're in need of real-time captions, they're available in the Zoom session. Click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles to view the captions. If you're new to the center, I want to welcome you to our community of scholars, practitioners, students, policymakers, and others who turn to the center for our research, educational initiatives, and nationwide network. The center was founded by former UC President Janet Napolitano in 2017 with the mission of exploring the intersection of expression, engagement, and democratic learning, and considering what can be done to restore trust in the value of free speech on campus and within society at large. In the past 7.5 years, we have created an impactful fellows research program, a UC mini grant initiative, a monthly podcast, as well as hosted numerous webinars and workshops about complex and challenging issues, including voting, youth engagement, why the First Amendment matters, academic freedom, institutional neutrality, legislative assaults on curriculum, and that's just to name a few. You might remember that 2017 was an eventful year for campus expression and for the narrative about free speech in higher education. Provocateurs were touring campuses to share their viewpoints, including at UC campuses, where they were greeted by protesters and by counter-protesters. Many might remember President Trump's infamous tweet following the violence that took place at UC Berkeley during a visit from British far-right political commentator Milo Yiannopoulos. Quote, "If UC Berkeley does not allow free speech and practices violence on innocent people with a different point of view, no federal funds." That tweet was more prescient than we ever expected. Since January 20th, the federal government has used executive orders and the threat of funding cuts in an attempt to suppress viewpoints with which they disagree, undermine cutting-edge research, and limit the creation and dissemination of knowledge. When we first conceived of today's theme, Truth, Trust, and Transformation, we could not have imagined the ways in which the higher education landscape would be transformed. This is a scary, challenging, and demoralizing moment to be discussing the issues on our agenda today. The stakes are real and very high. Livelihoods, funding, and the specter of punishment and retaliation for using a long list of words. Yet, in spite of this precarious moment, we are here together in conversation. Policymakers and advocates, administrators, faculty, students, we're all asking each other, what can we do in this moment to safeguard our institutions? And I think the one thing we can do is this: be in community to listen to, learn from, and support one another. Doing this takes courage, but we're doing it together, so let's get to work. Many of you submitted questions in advance of today. Thank you for that. If you'd like to pose a question during our various panels, please use the Q&A function. We'll do our best to get as many do our best to get to as many questions as possible. We're starting the day with a discussion about building and rebuilding trust in higher education. There's so much to explore: trust within the academy, between students and faculty, between faculty and staff, and amongst faculty, just to name a few of the permutations. There's also the dimension of trust between higher education and the public, including the many individuals who are not able to access what colleges and universities have to offer. Luckily, we have a literal trust expert to help us navigate and excavate all of these layers. Anthony Layden, a professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois at Chicago and the associate director of the Center for Ethics and Education, published Networks of Trust: The Social Costs of Colleges and What We Can Do About It last year. I'm going to turn things over to him to moderate this panel. Thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everybody. I'm really happy to introduce our panelists for this session. So we have, I'll go by the order they are on my screen. Stephen Mintz, professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Mintz is an award-winning teacher and author, and a leading authority on families, children, youth, and the life course. He's also published extensively on slavery, social reform, ethnicity, film, and pedagogy in higher education. So welcome, Stephen. Then we have Bobby Lauer, who is the president of Campus Compact, hard to say, the nation's largest organization dedicated to higher education, civic and community engagement, and advancing the public mission of higher education. Welcome, Bobby. And then we have Sanvi Arora, who is a public policy and computer science student at UC Berkeley, where she is also the external affairs vice president of the student union, and the executive director of the Youth Power Project, which is a youth-led organization that empowers young people under 25 to inform local, state, and federal policymaking based on their experiences. So welcome to the three of you and to our audience. And so I thought one way to start this discussion would be to get a sense of the kind of breadth and variety of things that might fall under this headline of trust in higher education. And so I thought we'd just start with a kind of lightning round and just ask you, what are one or two major relationships in and around higher education that you think of as currently characterized by distrust, and what the focus of that distrust is? And let's start with Sanvi on that one.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I think one of the biggest not even mischaracterizations, but characterizations around trust and distrust in higher education is related to how students interact with policing on their campus, and also just this perspective that there's a lack of moral alignment between institutions of higher education and student populations. A lot of the times, silence around current events harms students' ability to feel represented by their institution. And also, a lot of students have recent memories of increased policing on their K-12 campuses. I know that's been a topic of discussion. So a lot of young people do have adverse experiences with education systems, especially students of color. And I think that creates a lot of distrust to reach out to campus resources and campus support services. When there is retribution against students for reaching out to some of those services, those stories spread really quickly, and a lot of students end up feeling that, one, their university doesn't care about their well-being, but two, also that their university views those issues through very different lens than they do, and that creates this characterization that higher education is merely about maximizing revenue or maximizing the institution's business goals over the well-being of its students. So I think there can be more done to build communication around these critical issues and make sure students feel represented and heard. A lot of the times these institutions feel very far away and detached. So when students feel like they have a meaningful voice in the process, it really makes a difference.
Okay, great, thanks. And then Stephen.
Trust is the invisible framework that holds the academy together. It doesn't work if we don't believe that students are doing their best work, that administrators are committed to the campus's best interest, that faculty are genuinely committed to teaching and research. And all around us, we're seeing breaches of that trust. Faculty are shut out of crucial decisions about priorities and budgets. Chronic absenteeism and blatant disregard for academic integrity is too common among students, and I'm afraid even among researchers. Fewer faculty are present on campus, eroding the essential spontaneous collegial dialogue that fuels innovation. And staff are feeling mistreated, unappreciated, and sidelined. It is absolutely imperative that we rebuild trust within our campuses. It's not a matter of policy tweaks. It's a matter of a fundamental cultural shift. We need radical transparency. We need shared governance. We need to reaffirm classroom norms. We need to revitalize collegiality. We need to bridge the faculty-staff divide.
Right, thanks. And then Bobby.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the question, Tony, of where are those spaces where we've seen the broken trust? When we think about the public, that's a giant term. And there's a lot of headlines about the broken trust between the public and higher education. I think it's important in that situation to really ground ourselves. Are we talking about trust? Are we talking about value? Or are we talking about confidence? Because I do think there's been a conflation of a lot of those terms, particularly when we're talking about the national narrative around higher education. But I would absolutely argue that there has been a trust in that belief. There's been a break in that belief system, in the trust and the social contract between the public writ large and higher education. I also think we have to talk about what trust looks like at the local level, and I'm excited to dig into that. And then the other element that I think we haven't talked as much about related to trust within our sector is trust among institutions. And where do we stand today in terms of the trust within the sector, between particularly different institution types, between our Ivies, our R1s, and then our community colleges, public comprehensives. And I think we've seen, particularly in the past year, a real breaking down of trust between the institution types that I think there's been a lot of momentum and reason behind that over the past couple of years to get there.
Great. Is there any other relationships that we haven't touched on that you want to throw into the mix? Any of you?
Well, obviously, trust between government and especially the federal government and the campuses, which is wholly broken down.
Yeah. And then I think maybe one I would just throw into the mix is trust across what's often now called the diploma divide, and the lack of trust between people who have a college education, people who don't have a college education, about what they consider valid sources of information, how they think, as well as what they think about. Okay, so this is a really broad area, and we're not going to cover all of it in the 40 minutes we have. But I was wondering if we could maybe dive a little bit into what we think are the broader and deeper sources of that distrust. So rather than just characterizing, we have distrust here and we have distrust there, what's going on? Like, why is there all this distrust in this space? And I'll call on each one of you, but if any of you have something to add to follow up, I'd rather have this a conversation than just a series of answers. But let's start here with Bobby.
Okay, so I want to build on those points because I think, Steve and Tony, what you just said around the distrust between the government and higher education, and then also around the diploma divide, I think they all fit in and intersect with the broad kind of social contract of the public trust in higher education. And I think there's both elements to look at in the macro of like what is happening in society and how is that affecting trust in higher education, diploma divide being a piece of that. And then there's also just system failures that have gotten us to this point. And there's a multitude, but a couple that I would call out. The Lumina Foundation has been really aggressive with talking about the fact that we have 42 million US adults who started college and never finished. These are 42 million Americans who are sitting on debt and financial obligations for promises that weren't kept. And we as a broad sector have done a very poor job of figuring out how to ensure that these folks get to the finish line. So, and that directly connects to the broad, in any kind of data set around value and competence in higher education, affordability, and the financial component of what it costs for a degree today fit into that. But when we're talking about 42 million Americans who started and didn't finish, that's a giant, I think, failure and system failure that's going to lead to a lack of trust. Similarly, and this came up in Michelle's opening remarks, we have failed to meet the needs of particularly our most underserved populations. An example of one that we don't talk as much about is foster care youth. We have not moved the dial on college attainment for foster care youth writ large. There are small pockets of wins. There are small states that have been really aggressive where we've seen better movement. But nationally, we're still talking about 3 to 4% of individuals who experience foster care are graduating with a higher education degree. We have not figured out how to create the necessary support structures to support this population. All of these things, inside system failures, have led to, I think, distrust over time. I think another huge component around, and I'm talking more about like society's general confidence in higher education, that I think is then reflected in what part of what we're seeing around government at both at the state, local, and of course national level, is that we are inextricably linked to the strength of our society. Higher education in most cities, towns, and states is the largest employer. They're the largest provider of healthcare through university hospital systems. They are the hubs for arts and culture. They're the pillars of opportunity. And we can't talk out of both sides of our mouth and talk about being those central community engaged anchors, but then also remove ourselves where there's things that are not working for everybody across this country. So, a great example, I think, when we talk about trust is particularly right now, we're really working hard to make sure it's clear that research saves lives as the attack on the research enterprise of higher education is underway. But I think we have to consider the fact that for many, healthcare is not working for many people across this country, and higher education is mixed up in that. Higher education is an integral part of how that system functions. It's the same thing with schools. When people feel like schools are not meeting the needs of their kids, they see higher education as a piece of that puzzle. And I think we have not done a well enough job of really articulating how higher education both has a mission around the public purposes, but then needs to have ownership also of outcomes and what that looks like. Wealth inequality directly connects to what you're talking about related to the diploma divide. As we continue to have an increasing wealth inequality in this country, with the top 10% of the households having over 67% of the wealth in this country, we start to see, and we have seen the result in the election and in the data, that higher education is perceived as not something that's accessible for most. That it is being placed in a positionality that this is about something that is not accessible, that this is for the few than the many. And I think all of those things have gotten us to a place where the trust and the public social contract with higher education has been broken. The thing that I mentioned about the local level, because there's often this metaphor that is true, and then I think there's some holes in it that says, higher education, when you talk about it in mass, people don't have confidence in higher ed. But when you talk about your local college or university, it's a very different story. And that is true. The value proposition at the local level is true. It's the same thing when we talk about, well, at least we used to be able to talk about with Congress, right? Like, you may not like Congress, but you like your local congressperson. You can see the tangible results for you in your household. But I do think we have to also face that we've had some shifts around what local trust can look like. One example that I think is feeding into that when you talk about the sources, Tony, of like where trust is breaking down, is we are experiencing, and we'll talk about this, I know, about just leadership within our institutions. The churn of leadership is moving so fast. Most of us sitting in institutions have seen how many presidents, how many provosts, particularly over the past decade. The average presidency is just over 5 years today. And so what does that look like at the local level? That looks like community leaders, government leaders, citizens, kind of being in a whiplash of new initiatives, new strategies, new listening campaigns, and broken promises and unfulfilled promises around what it meant to be of community. That, the big initiative walks out the door with the president, and then the new president comes in so I think this inability to kind of stay the course, particularly about our local commitments, that we need stable leadership at our institutions. We need leadership that's going to be in an asset-based mindset, that's going to really look at communities as partners and think about how we move that work forward.
Great, thanks. That's a lot to think about. Stephen, do you want to add anything to that? Or
in the course of my academic career, I have seen higher ed undergo a seismic shift, and we have a label for that. It's the rise of the neoliberal university. And what we really mean by that is the transformation of higher education from a public good into a private good. And that has affected every dimension of how institutions operate. Faculty increasingly regard themselves, I think, as free agents whose own career and professional visibility is more important than their commitment to their institution. Students view themselves as customers and consumers, and that alters their relationship to the campus fundamentally. It becomes much more, what can you do for me, rather than what's my place in this. Administrators are CEOs. When was the last time that you heard a higher education leader really pronounce forcefully about the role of higher education in anything more than platitudes? This view, higher education as a private good, greatly undercuts any semblance of trust.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really important. And then, Sandra, do you want to add something in? And maybe also, we just got a question about the sacrifices that families make to send their kids to college. And, that touches on some of the things Bobby was saying, but maybe from the student perspective, if you have things to say about that, add that in. Otherwise, other sources of distrust you find in higher education at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. I think that, students, oh, sorry. I don't know what, are you all able to hear me still? It said that my internet was unstable for a second. Okay, great. I think that one issue that I wanted to talk about with regards to the private, related to this issue of privatization in higher education is kind of the issue of intellectual freedom on our campuses, and how intellectual freedom has been and highly polarized. There's been more intervention with regards to what should and shouldn't be taught on a higher education, on a college campus. And I think there's different interpretations of this. Some groups view this as censorship versus other groups viewing this as necessary to preserve the sanctity and integrity of higher education. And at the same time, some perceive a diversity in curriculum as academic rigor, but others experience or view that as an ideological issue. I think those kinds of more partisan lens do create different assessments, even for students, on whether higher education is fulfilling its mission of open inquiry, creating forums for dialogue, and making a consensus. And that kind of makes a consensus around whether or not institutions are performing to the best of their ability a little bit more difficult, not just for the public, but also for students. And I think that students nowadays have found themselves caught between these kinds of competing pressures, the desire to engage with more challenging ideas versus, concerns around creating inclusive environments. They want to express their authentic views, but they also fear social or academic or even political consequences. They want to also these kinds of tensions, I think, do end up spilling over, and students end up self-censoring their perspectives in certain classrooms. They end up feeling when their lives are looked as case studies in certain classes, that it's insensitive to, again, the sacrifices that their communities went through to kind of bring them here. And I think that creates a lot of disconnect between this idea of what the mission of higher education really is versus the role that your lived experience plays in informing your relationship to curriculum. I also think that a lot of students feel that our institutional leadership is a little bit paralyzed, and this could be due to the turnover piece that a lot of folks mentioned earlier, that our leadership isn't consistent. During times of crisis, there's no clear protocol, and understandably there's no protocol to life, and it makes sense. But I think that when it comes to times of crisis, a lot of students are creating their own mechanisms of support and own mechanisms of or they're bearing the burden of paying for, their own basic needs. The fact that some of our basic needs programs nowadays across the country are coming out of student fees, I think puts a lot into perspective for students, that their institution might not be there for them where it truly matters. And this idea that, the university provides a holistic education to a certain piece of the population on their campus, but not all of them, also creates a lot of disconnect and tension amongst the student body. So I think that's a little bit of what I have to say around sources of distrust. The last thing is a lack of student input and governance. And I think that this is a topic that gets talked about a lot, what exactly governance in education means when you are trying to include students. But I think like a lack of institutional silence, if institutions don't want to communicate with their student body, it does create a, like, it doesn't create the opportunity, or even it almost seems like a disinvitation to engage for students, like to feel like their voices aren't heard or aren't included in those conversations. So I think one thing that could tangibly be done is to make more an effort to talk to students, to not turn them away from discussions or meetings. I've heard of so many students across the country who don't even know what the president of their university looks like, and that's a huge problem. Like, you know, even if you're not meeting with students directly, showing up to spaces where it really matters for students to see you there, it really makes a difference and moves the needle. So I would say that that's a little bit about what I have to say. And then around the question around like family sacrifice to get to where you are. I mean, I'm like the daughter of immigrants, and I'm a first generation college student in the United States. So it means a lot to me that my parents like went through so much to get me here. And I think sharing that experience with a lot of my peers is really valuable, and having a community on my campus of students who share my background or share my experiences, like, has meant a lot to me to like just navigate like the emotional part of like going to university and really being like the only person in your family to understand that. So that's like I think like continuing to invest in community spaces. It's not like there's a lack of trust amongst our student body. Like they trust each other, they trust their communities. It's just like whether that trust translates to them wanting to engage in those institutions and reach out to those institutions for support. And right now there's overwhelmingly a consensus that students shouldn't reach out to an administrator for support and rather just turn to the peer-based resources around them. And I think there's value in creating, you know, space for both peer-based resources and institutional resources. I think they go hand in hand. But right now, investing in those peer-based spaces has been super helpful for students to just feel like a sense of stability despite everything else that's been going on.
Great, thanks. I mean, what I'm hearing from all of you in some sense is that, you know, one classic source of distrust is a felt sense that you are sacrificing or that you're experiencing loss and nobody is recognizing it or dealing with it or taking care of you in your time of need. And it seems like we have a lot of places on campuses and around campuses and in the society interactions with campuses where people are experiencing loss, feeling like they're making sacrifices, and yet that is not being noticed and recognized.
Tony, can I
Yeah.
jump in on that? So something I
Yeah.
want to add related to kind of that sense, right? Like that people have been feeling like they've been sacrificing and people haven't been paying attention. I think a thing also to talk about is like, what does that mean within higher education sector? Like getting, you know, in their own house, so to speak. And I think it is really important to recognize that the sentiment of many institutions and institutional leaders have been also feeling like that for years. Like on this panel, you know, the three institutions represented here are all R1 institutions, right? But the sector itself is incredibly diverse. And I think one of the things that's also contributing around this trust and lack and how we're moving forward and advancing higher education more collectively is also really reckoning with where have we gotten together? You know, there has been, I think what we saw last fall in particular brought to light, which has been a sentiment under kind of working under the ground for a while, which was a real sense of people not recognizing the sacrifice that particular public comprehensive institutions have been facing for years of declining sources of revenue, the ability to function, like going through massive cuts, while other institutions across the country have not been experiencing that. So in the same ways we see in our general economy, we've had pieces of that within the sector as well. And I say it because I think we have to be more honest about naming the inequities that exist in higher education. And we are painting, I worry sometimes, broad brushes about what's happening in higher ed without kind of pulling back and looking more specifically at, like, when we're talking about access and opportunity and really centering that as a value, what does it mean about community colleges? What does it mean about public comprehensive regional institutions? How do we understand the critical role that those play at a time when so much of the emphasis right now is particularly around elite, prestigious R1 institutions? But how do we talk about the necessity for all of our institutions? Because I think what's a danger is if we don't do this well, and if we don't face this head on as a sector, what we are also creating is a space where people are distancing themselves from those same elite and private institutions within the sector. And we need those institutions and all of our R1s now more than ever too. but we have to have a more, I think, like honest and direct conversation around the massive inequities and the scarcity kind of mindset that has existed in higher education, particularly at the state funding level for years, that has been a huge contributor of how we've gotten here. The engines of economic and social mobility are public regional institutions and community colleges and HBCUs and HSIs. And yet we've gotten to the point of really breaking this broad brush on the dangers of higher ed, when in reality, we haven't lifted up in a more holistic story. So I think we all need to own like the necessity for us as a sector to work together and build more trust in that regard too. And I don't think we spent enough time on that.
Tony, let
Yeah, no, I
me
think that's
reinforce
yeah.
something that Bobby just said,
Yeah.
which is that higher ed is the most stratified, prestige-conscious sector of our society, despite its self-image as being the very center of democratic promise. The difference in resources, in student preparation, among institutions is staggering. And the result is that the most needy students receive the fewest resources, and the most privileged students receive the most resources. And this is not a system that I think anyone should have immense trust in. We have to think of ourselves much more, I think, as an integrated system that is committed to universal success of our students. And it shouldn't be each tub on its own bottom, where I've got mine and too bad you don't have yours.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really excellent point. And that maybe brings us to the last topic I wanted us to get to, which is to look towards solutions and steps we might take, and maybe here to break it out by stakeholders, and just start with upper level administrators. What do you think, deans, provosts, university presidents, members of board of trustees, department chairs can do by way of fostering trust, building trust, and then we'll work sort of through other groups. With the upper level administrators, let's start with Bobby.
Yeah, I want to draw on Michael Roth from Wesleyan, I think has done some really great work in a lot of areas, but one in particular is he talks about what it means typically as a president to be a practical idealist. And I think that is a real recipe for success in this moment. We need presidents to boldly stand behind their values, to really boldly stand behind what higher education has been about, but also to balance that with real world action and compromise where needed in order to achieve the outcomes that we're seeking to get to. And I think our ability to have presidents that can do both of those things, that can work effect. And I will go back to part of that is, I think what we're seeing around presidents today, in particular, is the ability to do that. Some of it comes just down to longevity. Like where trust is about relationships. If we're back to the trust conversations, it's about people. And you don't build trust overnight. You build trust through listening. You build trust through showing up. You build trust through like showing proof points. That's how it happens. And so you can't build trust when you're a president that's been there for 3 months. Trust takes time. And so I think some of what we're facing is the reality of the short tenure of leaders without the kind of support, I think necessary support structures to support leaders right now. Our ability to have a little bit more grace and understanding. We live at a time when there is, such a rush to being right that often we're stepping over anybody in the meantime. And I think that comes down to what, Sanvi's talking about the ability then to have these kind of open frames of dialogue and discourse. I think courage in this moment of what it looks like for administrators is to sit in the uncomfortable, to sit in the spaces of dialogue and discourse. I think something that when I think about the senior leadership is that we need to embody those same commitments to dialogue and discourse that we're talking about for our students right now. There's pretty much not a campus around this country that you're not seeing an initiative around dialogue and discourse and bridging difference, which is super important. But we have to also make sure that our senior leaders are taking the responsibility for what that looks like at the cabinet level, what that looks like in collaboration with various governance structures. And I think that is a moment to kind of sit in, are we doing enough to bolster and support leaders in building up that civic muscle?
Yeah, great. I think, one message there for any senior leaders on this session is don't take the next job. Stay where you are. Sanvi, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of like students right now are worried about like the political capture of higher education. And I think that connects to Bobby's point that we need our leaders, one, to stay with us, and second, to actually to be vocal about like where they stand on certain issues, I think, or like how they're going to be supporting students, especially during times where students feel increasingly like their access to education isn't stable, that they're insecure about whether or not over the next few years they're even going to continue to enroll in university. And I think that also presents an important point around like the rising cost of tuition, like whether it's a worthwhile cost for students to like take on like that much debt, or go through so much financial hardship for a degree that they might not even be able to complete, given the way that their institutions may or may not be supporting them. So I think having vocal leadership is incredibly important. Communication is super, super important. And a lot of students right now are feeling like they don't know where their universities stand, whether their universities are going to roll over if they're put under enough pressure, and whether or not before rolling over those universities are going to actually communicate with students and protect them. So I think that's one really big concern. And one thing that could be done is really just bolstering communication, whether it be through and making sure that communication is straightforward and not super circular. A lot of the times administrative communication is super like, we just want to check off the box that we talked to you about it. But it's not really intentional about like meeting students where they are or answering like concrete questions. I think we need to have more town halls. I think like sometimes like our administrators I understand they're very busy individuals, but if they're not talking to students, then I feel like it would make their job harder to be able to create services or create policy that actually benefits students. So I think, we're by skipping the middleman of, talking to students, we are also skipping like a concrete, important like step in the process. So that's one thing I'd have to say. And the other thing is the idea around budgeting, just like being more transparent around budget allocations at the university. The students don't know where their money is going. It makes it really hard. And the other thing is that a lot of the times when universities are under budget cuts, especially from the state, the first thing to go are like staff intensive programs. And that makes sense from a fiscal perspective. But what doesn't make sense is that most of the time, those staff intensive programs are our health services, our counseling services, our basic needs services, and our like academic success coordinators. And usually the most staff intensive departments are the ones that are serving the communities that are least likely to be able to usually have the highest like dropout rates from university or aren't able to complete their degrees. So I think that we need to, if we're talking about like student retention and universities want to, pursue policy that retains students on their campus, they have to put their money there as well. And if students are seeing that research and like research is great, but a lot of students right now are frustrated that, when universities are under budget shortfalls, that they're like basic needs services are being cut over like research positions. And I think that creates a little bit of a disconnect as well for students. And finally, like I think that like tuition continues to be the cost of tuition, the cost of living in college continues to be a huge issue. And I want to like touch on what Bobby mentioned earlier around like this overwhelming like mainstream narrative around like traditional four-year education, and like what it means for us to actually prioritize or value the like diversity in different educational pathways. One like population of students that I think in addition to foster youth that I think isn't talked about enough is student parents on our campuses and parenting students who are, oftentimes need additional like accommodations or deserve a little bit more support from their universities. And those are also another example of like support services that end up being the first to go. So I think administrators should be a little bit more transparent with students. And also one last thing, sorry, I do talk a lot about this, but one last thing is kind of hiding behind the veil of student government. I'm in student government and I am really grateful to be able to like talk to administrators, but sometimes like you got to talk to people outside of student government in order to get a full picture. Like no one student can capture the experiences of all of our communities on our campuses. And I think that there needs to be more intentionality around like reaching out to students outside of these traditional governance structures, just because like I can't, or like none of my student like government peers really truly represent like every one of our students. And you can get, it's not a representative consultation of the student body to just talk to student government.
All right, thanks. I have a follow-up, but I want to first make sure we get into talking about faculty and students a bit. So Stephen, you can take make recommendations for upper administrators, but if you could also talk a little bit about what you think faculty ought to be doing to be building trust, that would be good, because we want to get some time for Q&A as well.
You and I know what a great education looks like. It's a relationship-rich education that is well-grounded in the liberal arts. And is that what we're really offering? I don't think so. What we have instead is a fragmented curriculum that is very disciplinary based. It's not thematic. It's not particularly interdisciplinary. And it's not immersive, involving a lot of active, inquiry-based and project-based learning. We know that that's the most effective form of education. And we do not train faculty for the most part to offer that kind of education. We don't provide the support that they need to offer that kind of education. And then should we be surprised that many of our students are disaffected, alienated, and don't feel going to class is worthwhile, that they've become do-it-yourself learners? We understand all that. That's a question of priorities. It's a question of training. One semester, I taught 1,451 students. The only students I knew plagiarized, right? Those are the only students I knew by name. There were no breakout sessions. This is not an education, right? What's the difference between that and a MOOC? Not much. And again, we need to be clear about our priorities. Faculty need to make it clear what a real education looks like, and we need to do everything in our power to offer all of our students, regardless of institution, that kind of education. When I taught at Columbia, my largest class had 17 students. Okay. I haven't taught a single class at the University of Texas at Austin with 17 students. The smallest classes I've taught have been with 40 students. And while I do my best to get to know those students, that's not the kind of education I had as an undergraduate.
Yeah, good. I'll just note that elite colleges often cite their faculty-student ratios as a way of saying how great they are. And at poor universities like mine, administrators tend to count credit hours per FTE, which is the exact inverse of student-faculty ratios, as a measure of the efficiency of departments, which also goes to the spread and disparity in the sector. Let me just come back to students, and then I want to leave some time for questions at the end. So Sanvi, I just ask you, like, what do you think the responsibility of students is to build trust? And second, so can you answer that? And also, somebody was asking in the Q&A if you think there are like overwhelming preferences for how administrators can share information with students. So if administrators want to be transparent, like literally, should they be emailing? Should they be on social media? Should they be wandering around the campus, talking to people, throwing frisbees?
I'll answer that question first in terms of what modalities administrators can use. I think a good model that we found that I found really helpful, at least at UC Berkeley, has been the town hall model. So we are able to bring our whole administrative cabinet in to just have an open town hall with students 2 hours, and we try to do it on a semesterly basis. And we do one specific to public safety and campus safety, which I think is also helpful to have a tailored conversation around what administrators can do to help students feel safe on campus. And obviously that takes many different forms, and having the entirety of our administration show up is really helpful. So that's one thing that I think the in-person, or even if it's virtual, direct dialogue format is super helpful. I think it also helps students get to know where administrators are at and who they are. A lot of the time students don't really know who their student affairs staff are unless they're in trouble, which is what Stephen said earlier. So I think that creating more pathways for students to interface with administrators beyond disciplinary proceedings is super important, because I think it helps unvilify administrators in students' minds. That being said, of what like students specifically can be doing is one, continuing to engage and like build those relationships. I think like there is like a lot of students like do disengage, and something that and it's very valid for the reasons why they do. A lot of students feel like when they repetitively reach out, they're ignored, or their continued advocacy to like administrators is punished or not necessarily valued. I think that like encouraging students to reach out to administrators and faculty in more constructive means is something that we're always encouraging students to do. Like faculty and administrators won't know something's wrong unless someone shares oftentimes that something is going wrong, and students are often the first people to realize or on the front lines of that. So I think that kind of feedback loop is super important, and students obviously need to be involved in that for that feedback loop to actually be a loop. So that's super important. And then second, I think creating a culture around collaboration. I think there's like obviously people have talked about higher education becoming more and more competitive over time, and I think students have a little bit to do with that in terms of the way that they sometimes contribute to campus culture or narrative around like there being a cutthroat environment. Students are pitted against each other, and they're actively pitting each other against each other. So I think that addressing that is important. Talking to students about what it means to like be a peer and move with empathy and hold space and be inclusive of their other like fellow peers is super important, and it's always something that we're trying to do. I think students are generally trying to be good people, but when there's like a lot of pressure, especially economic pressure, and like obviously like the postgraduate pressure to like, okay, once you're done with college or you're trying to get to one place or the other, a lot of students are in like a survival mode. So if there's anything that we can do to support students to make sure that they're able to live like full lives beyond just surviving day to day, I think that'll also help with them building a better culture with one another around like empathy, collaboration, support. And I think that'll really help with just broader like distrust narratives as well. Because I mean, when you're in a state of crisis, it's the first step is to try to to fulfill your needs, but also then resent like the institutions or systems that you feel like didn't help you fulfill your needs. So I hope that kind of answers the question you were asking.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Stephen or Bobby, do you have anything else you want to add into what various stakeholders should be doing while I look for questions?
Well, I'll add one thought. We have two teaching modes. We have lecture classes and we have discussion classes. And those aren't the right models, I think, anymore. Imagine in the arts, we have studio courses where students get a lot of peer feedback about projects that they're doing. What a wonderful model. Why should it be confined to the arts? It could apply in every facet that we teach. Or imagine courses that involve community service or community outreach. Again, wonderful models. We have a 5-course a term expectation to graduate in 4 years. That's impossible for most students these days. And even at the most privileged institutions, students are spending a lot of time on extracurriculars. We need to rethink the actual educational experience. Once again, it needs to be relationship rich, immersive, and involve active projects.
The thing I will add, Tanya, just very quickly, is I also think it's important when we're talking about particularly at the leadership level, but this is across the board, because I think it's when we talk about the relationship between the public and, so outside the institution with the institution, important to know that like that is 1,000 points of light. The experience, how the public and communities and neighbors experience our institutions is not through one person, it's through a multitude of touch points. And I think in order to build that trust, this is also a moment, again, if we're talking about trust and not value and confidence, then we also have to own. And this is not the moment just to defend the status quo. Like there have been real harms from higher education over time, particularly when you're talking about the community level, whether that's through gentrification and development. And then there's harms of just continuing to not meet the needs and be the vehicles for social and economic mobility that we have espoused to be. And I think the first step in building trust in any relationship, right, when it's broken, is owning up to our own failures. And so I do think our ability to do that within students, faculty, staff, and at the senior level in ways that are also grounded in and what do we do to move forward? And what do we do to move forward in collaboration? This is a moment for higher education to be doubling down on its commitment to being community-centered. This is not the time to retreat. That is the prescription of addressing trust. The reality that higher education are critical more than ever anchors in our communities because of the economic realities of what our economy looks like today with industry and the role of higher ed. We have got to be even more serious about what it means to be community-centered. And that means we need to be in a co-development and in the same way Sanvi's talking about with students, community members also need to have real seats at the table.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. And that actually leads into, there are a number of questions on the Q&A about community engagement. And I want to just take up because I think it raises a sort of more difficult problem than maybe some of the others, which is, if we think of higher education as a public good, and we think of the research that goes on in higher education as a public good, then one question is like, to what degree do faculty especially, and the funding priorities, I guess, of universities generally have an obligation to make their research community-oriented to be something that benefits the public? And to what degree should we trust that faculty who pursue interests that are, intellectually exciting for them will come around to doing something that is of value to the public? I don't know, maybe Stephen, you can start with that one.
Well, I'm a great believer that the alternative to the model of student as customer is student as partner and collaborator and creator of knowledge. And that we, working together with students on various projects that deal with real world issues, can be transformative for students, but also can send a powerful message to the public that we're not just about transmitting knowledge. We're about genuinely creating students who have the skills to do real projects. Let me give you one example that's a simple one. When I taught in Houston, we had a pretty close relationship with the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and the museum, which is the fourth largest museum in the country. And they allowed us to create the educational sites, the sites used by teachers for their exhibits. Of course, they used LA and San Francisco and Brooklyn design firms for their public-facing websites, but for their educational websites, they used us, that is, our students. Students felt that their work was genuinely meaningful, and it gave them something to put on their resume. And so it was a win-win situation. So even in my discipline, history, you can figure out ways to serve the public.
Can I add a couple points to that, Tony?
Yeah, please.
It's a great question. And I think we're at a real inflection point in that. So one that I would specifically point to is there has been positive momentum, particularly over the past decade. I think we're all very concerned about where broader impact is going to go. What is that going to mean, particularly when we're talking about NSF and then the reality of all of the other funding agencies? The ability to do the work, the ability to make scholarship enterprise more community engaged requires a set of components. It requires both funders prioritizing that as outcomes. And so I think like when we think about like broader impacts at NSF, but many of the cuts that we have seen thus far are putting that work in jeopardy around from a variety of the agencies. It also requires institutional commitments. And what does that look like? That means having serious conversations at the department and at the divisional level about PTRM. What are we actually valuing in this time? Are we really valuing the faculty and staff contributions around public engaged scholarship? And then it also has to do with support. And I know I saw a question in the chat that said, when we're coming into budget cuts, the community engaged staff and resources are often, on the cutting room floor. That now is not the time for that. And I don't just say that because those are the 700 folks who are with Sanvi and I last week in Atlanta, but because this work of doing community engagement to rebuild public trust takes real competency. Understanding how to build partnerships, understanding how to do community collaborated and co-generated knowledge is not something that faculty walk in with experiences on. So we need to also invest in the professional class and the support systems that make sure our campuses can keep doing this.
I also want to add one more thing is that like
Sorry.
marginalization isn't a case study. And when we see like universities like turning to like these support services so that they can meet certain like for example, like HSI status or like these different kinds of like I guess, like benchmarks of being a good campus or a good university, I think it's really obvious to students. And that's why we see that those are often those services that get a university to that point are often the first to go when those universities are under pressure financially. The other thing that I wanted to add, though, is that like when it comes to research and effective community engagement, like I said before, marginalization isn't a case study, and a lot of communities that universities study like feel like used by those universities, feel disrespected, feel like they're under a microscope in a really like negative dehumanizing way. And I think that has also created a negative perception around academic research and what it really means to consent to being a part of an academic study. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on is this idea that a lot of universities, like I said before, are trying to chase like these kinds of titles of being like diverse or inclusive, which is important. But they're going about it in a very performative way. And there needs to be a little bit more done to really understand what the relationship between a university and its surrounding neighborhood looks like in that process. As Bobby said, like we need to own up to like the displacement and gentrification that happens oftentimes when big universities end up like displacing entire communities. At Berkeley, we have that issue a lot, and because of that, our university and our student body has made a really big commitment to working really closely with City Council and having regular meetings. I think that has created more collaboration between community members and our university. But I think that's something a model that we can take to other campuses as well to build more cohesion and trust.
Tony,
Great.
let
Well,
me offer
yeah.
one more
You got 30
example.
seconds.
Okay, down in the lower Rio Grande Valley, which is one of the poorest areas of the United States, we built a new university. And much of our focus was on healthcare because the region is terribly underserved medically. And so we developed a curriculum to prepare people. We called it middle school to medical school, but it was really about preparing people to be in the healthcare industry. And every facet. So the literature courses were on narratives of pain and illness. The history classes were on the history of public health. The goal was to really engage everyone in serving the community.
Great, thanks. Well, I want to thank all our panelists. I think one of the things that's come out of this conversation is one way to build trust is to be consciously aware that it's a thing that needs building. And that it's something we can all work on together by attending to one another's needs and loss and sacrifice and working together to build community. And I hope this has begun that process today. So thank you very much.
I want to add my thanks. I know that people were listening because there were so many questions coming into the Q&A, and I just want to let people know that you can learn more from all of these folks. Read Tony's book, look into Campus Compact, type it. Steve's had some great pieces on trust in the Chronicle, and Sanvi is doing great work as a student representative. So I don't think this has to be the end, but the beginning. So I want to thank all of you. Again, it's always hard. There's never enough time. So thank you so much. And I really thought that was thought-provoking, and it's super strong start to our time together. And now we move to kind of our next sort of panel or conversation, and hearing from Berkeley Law Dean Erwin Chemerinsky and UC Irvine Chancellor Howard Gilman, the co-chairs of the Center's National Advisory Board, has become a regular staple of our Speech Matters conference, and this year is no exception. They're back and better than ever. I'm not going to read you their bios because they're easily available. I want to save the time to ask questions. They have graciously agreed to answer questions posed by yours truly about the current legal, higher education, and democracy landscape. Please feel free to add your questions as well to the Q&A. So thanks for being here as part of the 7th Annual Speech Matters. I will say, I guess I'll start by saying that when we came up with the theme of this conference, our vision of the transformation piece, I think, was more of a chrysalis, this sort of idea of caterpillar to a butterfly, a focus on innovative ways that knowledge is being created and disseminated. And I know that I certainly didn't anticipate the amount of destruction and retrogression that's taking place within colleges and universities across the United States right now. Yeah. I kind of want to start by talking about the impact of how higher ed is being reshaped. You are both senior administrators in public higher ed, chancellor. You head an R1 institution that includes an academic medical center. Dean, you oversee one of the top law schools in the United States, responsible for training, future lawyers. Can each of you start by sharing some ways that the steps that the current administration is taking, executive orders, funding cuts, et cetera, will impact the life of the average American who may or may not interface with higher education directly? And Chancellor, why don't you kick it off?
Sure. Thanks, Michelle. By the way, Michelle, thank you so much for your tremendous leadership of the center and for everyone that made this conference possible. We knew for the last couple of years that this was going to be the most challenging political environment for American higher education in a long time. Most of that is because many conservatives, as revealed in public opinion polls, had dramatically declining trust in higher ed. They believed that there was a political monoculture, that there was not really a toleration of conservative viewpoint. They thought there was too much politicized scholarship. Whether or not all of those accusations are true, it's very hard for public institutions to maintain strength within a political system if half the country thinks they're moving in a wrong direction. And hopefully that will have led to some self-reflection on the part of colleges and universities. In fact, the reason why we put together the UC National Center on Free Speech is that we did believe that there was a need for colleges and universities to think more carefully about what it means to embrace viewpoint diversity. Mostly, though, we saw this manifest in red state legislatures that were trying to control and influence the culture of higher ed. Florida's Stop Woke Act it was just one example. There are very concerning aspects of some of those efforts relating to the core principles of free speech and academic freedom. But we assumed that when there was the results of the last election, that some of those efforts were going to be nationalized. What I didn't predict was this incredibly disruptive and even destructive effort to attack the fundamental ability of leading research universities in particular to do the kind of medical research, scientific research, technological innovation that has served this country so well, really at least since World War II. There was a compact between the federal government and research universities to help support the research infrastructure of universities and then fund the very best ideas. And I think if there's one thing that people generally agree on is that American higher education, and especially the research coming out of our universities, is the envy of the world. And so to see now these efforts to cut back on grants that are funding medical or scientific research, it really is incredibly disruptive. And universities have internal issues that they have to face. But what it means for the general public is that your confidence that in the United States, there are people working on the next cure for cancer or addressing issues of Alzheimer's or finding the next internet or helping to better understand AI, that there's going to be less of that activity. That really has a dramatic impact on the country as a whole. And we will see how that plays out, especially as Congress starts to move toward its budget process. And they ask basic questions like, what will the National Institutes for Health have as a budget in order to keep medical research going? What will the NSF be doing to keep scientific research going? It is a very challenging time. I'm hoping that it doesn't turn out to be as potentially destructive as it could, but it has an impact on the lives of every person in the country.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Dean.
I agree with everything that Howard just said, starting with thanking you, Michelle, for all you do for the center and for putting this conference together. I want to put what Howard said, though, in a broader context. He talks about the loss of faith in universities, but there's also a loss of faith in all of the institutions in society. There's a loss of faith in the federal government. The Pew Research Institute does a survey, and they've done it since the 1950s, of confidence in the federal government. The high water mark was in 1964 at 77%. Last year, it was at 20%. There's a loss of confidence with regard to the press, and you see that in the opinion polls that are surveyed. And you also see the loss of faith in higher education. To answer your question, Michelle, if there is a path towards authoritarianism in this country, this is where we're at. I've never been so afraid for the future of democracy as I am right now. What we're talking about is an administration that's been in power for less than 3 months. And think of some of the things that have happened, and then I can answer your question directly. We've seen the administration claim that it can eliminate federal agencies like the United States Agency for International Development, the Department of Education, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Agencies are created by federal statute. Only Congress can eliminate them. We've seen the administration say that it can slash billions or trillions of dollars in federal funding. Congress has the spending power. The president can't refuse to spend money appropriated by statute. There's even a federal law, the Impoundment and Control Act, that says that the president can't refuse to spend money. The president has claimed the ability to fire anyone who works in the executive branch. This includes commissioners on agencies where there's statutory protection, but also includes civil service workers. Civil service exists since the 19th century, and the president has claimed that any limit on removals of firing violate his power. So we've seen massive layoffs in agencies throughout the federal government. The president has claimed the authority to incarcerate individuals in El Salvador without providing any judicial review. In fact, the Solicitor General, in a brief in the Supreme Court on Monday, said that when people are put in El Salvador, no court can provide them recourse. We've seen the targeting of universities, as Howard was talking about. And we've now seen a whole list of universities, starting with Columbia, but then Harvard and Princeton and Brown and Cornell and Northwestern, and the list goes on. We've seen the targeting of law firms solely for the clients they represented or the lawful zealous advocacy. And the only reason given was retribution. And I think it's so important we all keep in mind that this is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this in all of American history. Now, in terms of what it's going to mean for people's lives, even though Social Security money hasn't been cut, there have been massive layoffs in the Social Security Administration. This then means if people have questions about benefits or issues with regard to eligibility, there aren't going to be people to help them. There have been massive layoffs and change of policy with regard to the Environmental Protection Agency and the protection of the environment. That's going to affect the air we breathe, the water we drink. There have been massive layoffs with regard to food inspectors. Again, one of the strengths in the United States is the safety of our food system. It's going to all affect us if we're more likely to become ill. And of course, then what we can talk about is exactly what Howard did, cutting medical research, cutting back on the funding of the NIH, firing the directors of the National Institutes of Health. This is then going to put back research with regard to cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes. For years, I often wonder about whether it's like Humpty Dumpty. Once it's all fallen apart, can it ever be put back together again?
It's definitely very, very sobering, but it's important to understand what the stakes are. So you already sort of talked a little bit about one of the levers that's being pulled, which is the threat of reducing federal funding. So I want to turn to another way the administration is accomplishing its goals, which is through the use of the immigration system. I anticipate that many of our participants are familiar with the arrest and detention of Rumeysa Öztürk, the Tufts graduate student who was surrounded and arrested by 6 plainclothes officers while on her way from her apartment to an iftar dinner. Immigration officers didn't show badges until Öztürk had already been restrained. Although no charges have been filed against her, her visa status has been revoked. She's one of a number of foreign nationals studying at prestigious American universities to be arrested for alleged activities related to terrorist organization. Öztürk is represented by the ACLU, who argues that this arrest was retaliation for an op-ed criticizing the war in Gaza that Öztürk published last year in the Tufts Daily. We've had a number of questions that were pre-submitted along the lines of, do non-citizens have First Amendment rights in the United States? And can the government revoke a visa or a green card because of political speech?
I'm so glad you're focusing on this. To be clear, the First Amendment protects the speech of all in the United States, citizen and non-citizen alike. In 1945, in a case called Bridges versus Wixon, the United States Supreme Court explicitly said that non-citizens are protected by the First Amendment and freedom of speech. In fact, if you look at the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment that applies to the federal government, it says no person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It's not limited to citizens. and thus revoking a visa or a green card on the basis of speech should be found to violate the First Amendment.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll just add, really what happened at Tufts is one of the most shocking things that we have seen in the context of higher education in a long time. And I'm grateful that so many national organizations, people on all sides of the political spectrum, have raised serious concerns. The idea that someone who is lawfully in this country because of some speech because they gave a speech or expressed a viewpoint that the administration doesn't like, could just for that reason be kicked out of the country or denied the ability to stay is something that we would all have to stand up against. I will say, though, that there are other circumstances with visa revocations that are a change in the enforcement policies, but don't necessarily raise these fundamental questions about the right of people to express themselves. We've been seeing over the last week or so many student visas being revoked on college campuses, including mine, throughout the University of California, and I know throughout the country. A lot of these, as far as we could tell, these revocations are unrelated to any protest activity. It seems like they're taking a list of student visas and comparing it to a list of whether, I don't know, you might have had a misdemeanor conviction, and saying that that violated people's terms of their student visas. That is a policy question. I don't think it raises the same kind of fundamental issues that Erwin was discussing. It could be good or bad to have stronger enforcement or less strong enforcement, but it's especially important to keep an eye out for circumstances under which what the administration is going to do is simply punish individuals or institutions, not because of any violation of law, but instead because of viewpoints that are being expressed. That strikes at the core of what the First Amendment is designed to prohibit.
Absolutely. And I'm happy that you teased apart those two distinctions. But as you already mentioned, the idea that someone might be punished, right? The prospect of being punished by the government for speech is a terrifying prospect for citizens and non-citizens alike. And as leaders of two different educational communities, I'm wondering if you can speak to what campus leaders can be doing to reassure not just their international students, but also help lessen the incredible chilling effect that, that one video can have across the country.
I mean, when you have an administration that has not yet been constrained by courts sufficiently, it does create an environment where people might know that they have, in theory, legal protections for the activities they engage in, but just because your activity may be protected doesn't mean that you are not going to be put in a very complicated situation if the government decides, to move forward. So I don't want to overstate the amount of reassurance that you can give. A chilling environment is a chilling environment. We have to be as strong as we can to defend this as a core, not just university value, but a core American value. It's one of the reasons why this center was created in the first place. It's one of the reasons why Erwin and I have spent a better part of the last 10 years writing about and engaging these fundamental questions. And we do want to say that to our community, we are still there to support you in the expression of your ideas. It is very important, even under these circumstances, for people to understand that they have a right to express views that are inconsistent with the preferences of the government. And we will stand shoulder to shoulder with people if we think that basic principle is being violated.
Howard put it perfectly, but I think what I'd add to that is what we have to do as leaders of education institutions is be clear with our students what we can and what we can't do for them.
Yeah.
What we can do, as Howard said, is be very clear about our values. And I will be outspoken in condemning revoking visas or apprehending people because of the message they express. We also have to inform students about their rights, and we need to let them know what ICE can and can't do. And another aspect of it is advising students, as our international office do, if they're on visas, to be careful about choosing to leave the country because they may not be able to get back in.
Right.
But we have to inform students with regard to their rights. But there's also a limit to what we can do to protect students. And I don't want to ever have students have the illusion that we can do more than we can. I've had students say, why can't we create a sanctuary in the law school where ICE can't come? I had a faculty member day before yesterday say, well, can I have undocumented students come in my office and ICE can't enter? And the answer is, we can't stop ICE from coming to school. We can't stop ICE from apprehending people. And so we can inform people about their rights. We can stand for our values. We should do all we can, but we shouldn't offer false promises either.
Thank you. I want to move to kind of another motivation that the administration has cited, not just for arresting some international students, but also for sending warning letters to, I think it's 60 institutions across the US, sort of doubting whether these schools have fulfilled obligations under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to protect Jewish and other students on campus, including ensuring uninterrupted access to campus facilities and educational opportunities. So data from numerous sources has shown a spike in anti-Semitism on college campuses, but at the same time, anti-Semitic sentiment is often expressed through protected forms of speech. The Office of Civil Rights explained in one of their recent guidance letters that Title VI protects students from invidious discrimination, but is not intended to regulate the content of speech. Yet, as both of you know, speech acts can be considered part of an evaluation of whether or not a hostile education environment exists. And I know that you both have been writing and talking about this tension for quite some time now. And I'm hoping you can share some thoughts about how universities can both fight anti-Semitism and other kinds of discrimination while also safeguarding speech, given the administration's very aggressive use of Title VI in this moment.
Yeah. Well, let me start. The one interesting thing to point out here, the reason why Erwin and I have been writing about this for a while is that this is an issue, the balance between your obligations to provide a non-discriminatory learning environment and your obligation to protect free speech, those tensions, those issues arise and have arisen both within Republican and Democratic administrations. In fact, to put what we're seeing now in context, it was really over the last few years that the Office of Civil Rights was I think conveying relatively ambiguous and troubling guidance to universities about what the implications would be if we allowed people on the campus to engage in protected expressive activity that other people found made them feel uncomfortable. And we have argued that it can't be the case that you hold a university responsible for violating non-discrimination, federal law against discrimination, just because people on the campus are exercising their free speech rights. But that hasn't always been the view, even of Democratic administrations. And we're now seeing, I think, just a much stronger effort to use that threat, the threat of claiming that you didn't quite do enough to protect your students, as a basis for requiring institutions to engage in negotiation settlements that might actually include terms that would violate, I think, core principles of free speech and academic freedom. It's very important for institutions to protect every protected member of their communities against a discriminatory learning environment. There's no question about that. But part of what we're seeing is, for example, in the case of Columbia, the administration simply declaring with no due process and no investigation that Columbia was in violation of Title VI, demanding that Columbia quickly change its internal practices, including its admissions practices and including its monitoring of certain departments, as a condition of avoiding the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars of federal funds. And that has to be, I think, taken very seriously as an abuse of the responsibilities under Title VI and the coordinated responsibilities under our commitment to free speech. It is perfectly legitimate for the federal government to investigate claims of discrimination, to go through it in a way that includes due process, to have findings that are based on fact, and then to see what the normal legal processes would be in the wake of that. But my worry is that that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing threats in the absence of due process, and the resolution of those threats, in many cases, have nothing to do with concerns about discrimination. Columbia's admissions practices have nothing to do with any issue about whether or not they've created a discriminatory learning environment for Jewish students. They're using this cudgel as a way of extracting and threatening and extracting other concessions from higher ed that reflect a broader political agenda rather than really taking seriously issues of discrimination, which all universities should take very seriously.
I agree. I'll make 4 quick points just to amplify. First, it's a reminder, of course, that hate speech is generally protected by the First Amendment, unless it becomes incitement or a true threat or harassment. Second, that Title VI says that there can't be a discriminatory, hostile environment on the basis of race or ethnicity, and speech can create a hostile environment. That doesn't mean that the campus can or should punish speech, but the standard is it can't be deliberately indifferent to that. Third, it's not clear what's enough for a campus to avoid being deliberately indifferent. There's a list of things that campus might do, but courts haven't yet answered that question. And finally, where I will strongly agree with Howard, is what's being done in targeting universities is really using anti-Semitism as a pretext. I don't think that there's a reasonable argument that Columbia or any of these universities were deliberately indifferent with regard to what occurred. Many believe Columbia, if anything, reacted too aggressively in using law enforcement. But it's also to amplify what Howard said, that there's procedures that are supposed to be followed before any cutoff of funds. Notice, hearing, findings of fact, 30 days notice to both the House and the Senate. None of those were met. Also, if there's a cutoff of funds, it can only be the program that was found discriminatory. That wasn't met here. And so I think this is an effort by the Trump administration to really try to exercise control over universities in a much larger sense. And all of the examples of the Columbia settlement that Howard mentioned show that.
All right, thank you. I can't believe we're almost out of time. There's so many questions coming in. One I want to ask, because I think people are really hungry for things that they might be able to do. This person sort of posits that Congress isn't going to stop the current regime's elimination of opposition. So what can we be doing within the rule of law? Should we get more active with civil society, donate to judicial elections, support the ABA? I know, Dean, that you were sort of one of the folks that got deans of law schools together to work to support law firms that have been targeted. So any thoughts that people might be able to do outside of something like protest, which obviously feels risky in this moment?
I think there's 3 things. First, people need to be informed about everything that's happening. I've heard too many people, including students, say, I stopped listening to or reading the news. We can't afford to do that. Second, we have to be involved. There's, of course, many different ways of being involved. There are organizations that are fighting back. They can use volunteers. They can certainly use financial support. Getting involved may be signing petitions. It may be going to protests. But it's so important that for the issues that we care about, we involve. And third, I think it's so important that we speak out, that what we know about authoritarianism is it depends on there being silence. And again, people can speak out in a variety of different ways, but at this moment in time, the only way in which we can stand for the values that Howard and I are expressing is to speak out in favor of them.
Chancellor, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's why conferences like this are so important, just to remind people of the values. And in this moment, we also need to disentangle different things that people are worried about. There are concerns about what the budget, for example, of the National Institutes for Health or the National Science Foundation will be. We think it would be harmful to the country if those budgets were dramatically slashed. That is ordinary politics, right? Doing ordinary investigations of whether there's discrimination on campus in accordance with due process of law, that is ordinary politics, and that is fine. But what is deeply problematic are these suggestions now where a lot of unilateral decisions, threats outside of legal processes are attempting to bully and silence people on campuses. And it's at a time like this when an old-fashioned notion like support for the rule of law is going to be essential. The more that we can get these debates within normal legal processes, the fewer people will be picked up off the street and end up in an El Salvadorian jail, right? Universities will be able to have their arguments about whether their activities are discriminatory or not. But fundamentally, if you want universities in the United States to continue to make the extraordinary contributions they have made over the decades to the well-being of the country and the world, mostly what you have to focus on are protections of free speech and academic freedom. And because in any authoritarian society, the first thing you attempt to do is to silence voices of independent spirit. And that's usually courts, that can be the media, and it's also universities. So this is a time when universities need to distinguish between concerns they may have about normal policy debates and what is most fundamental, so that we can continue to make the contributions that we've been making for so long.
So I know that, Dean, you mentioned that this is unprecedented in American history, and yet I wonder if there's anything that we can learn from other difficult times that this country has faced that we might be able to utilize as we move forward, either in terms of times when things were bad or from social movements like, right, the Berkeley Free Speech Movement or others. So from either of you, maybe an opportunity to look back and pull forward as we sort of turn to close.
Relative to universities, the closest analog would be the McCarthy era. And what we can learn is how bad things went when universities capitulated to pressure, faculty losing their jobs, students being expelled just on the basis of suspicion. And one of the lessons in hindsight is how important it is to be clear about our values, to be true to those values, and to speak up as to those values, so this doesn't, in hindsight, become something like the McCarthy era.
Thank you.
Right. I mean, as we wrote in our first book on free speech on campus, the McCarthy era was a very dark period of time, not just for national politics, but for universities, university leaders, university organizations that capitulated way too quickly under these threats. But what's interesting about the McCarthy era compared to now is that the McCarthy era was targeting these efforts on, in particular, faculty members who might have had some affiliation with socialist or communist organizations or were viewed as fellow travelers. It was an attempt to sort of exile from the academic community people that were viewed as insufficiently anti-communist. In some respects, the efforts that we're seeing now are much more serious and sweeping, because it's not an effort to pick individual people and then remove them from the academic environment. It's an effort on the part of the government to take more systematic control over what universities can teach, what their curriculum is, what people can say. That is, I think, a much more serious threat. And we should take the lesson of the McCarthy era that capitulation will never get you anywhere except a dark mark in the history books, and instead understand that we all have a stake in defending everyone's free speech, in defending viewpoint diversity, and the independence of thought that are central to the well-being to the functioning of modern universities.
Well, certainly I think UC is lucky to have both of you. I'm lucky that the center has both of you. And I know I'll see you next year at the conference, but I think there's going to be a campus, Free Speech on Campus 2.0 that must, be getting bigger every day, and looking forward to reading that and having you back to talk about it. So thank you to you both. And I think that this is a really good opportunity. We're going to transition to kind of our second longer panel. And I saw some questions that were already in the chat that had to do with what we're going to be talking about next, which is disinformation and misinformation, another complex set of issues that reaches really beyond colleges and universities, and something that we contend with on a daily basis. Whatever forms mis and disinformation take, they impact polarization, they impact learning, and they impact whether or not people rely on expertise, which of course is at the core of higher education. Dr. Connie Moon Sahat is our esteemed moderator for this conversation. She is the Director of Research and the co-founder of Discourse Labs, a nonprofit that develops tools and resources for productive public dialogue. As a researcher, her work has focused on questions related to information and conversational quality, as well as ethical practice. Connie has focused on intersections of technology and democratic life for over 25 years, and it's a privilege to have her be part of Speech Matters. Take it away, Connie.
Well, and yes, we're here to talk about disinformation, and the decline of expertise. I feel very privileged to be sharing the stage, as it were, with my fellow panelists. I'm going to introduce them briefly so that we can use as much time as possible just to get to discussion and questions. Please welcome Simone Chambers, Professor of Political Science at UC Irvine, Chris Coward, Senior Principal Research Scientist at the University of Washington Information School, and Michael Wagner, the FJU Distinguished Chair for the Wisconsin Idea at the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Wisconsin. And I like how everyone here is coming from this at this from different disciplines, so I think this will be a very interesting chat. So maybe just to set the stage, I mean, it doesn't take very much to kind of think about basically misinformation in different ways, at least if you're paying attention to the news. A recent example, as many here may be familiar with, just happened on Monday in terms of an erroneous claim that President Trump was considering a 90-day pause on tariffs. And this resulted in trillions of dollars, basically, going up and down in terms of the stock markets. So, you know, as someone who comes at this from a historical perspective, though, I think that we also know that misinformation, if we take that to be inaccurate information, is as old as time. And also we can think about, you know, disinformation basically in terms of this effort potentially to actively share inaccurate information to cause harm or for gain. You know, not being, again, too far from our thoughts in terms of history. So it's been around basically for a while. Given this, I guess, you know, one of the main questions I sort of would love to hear from all of our panelists about are, you know, like, what is higher education's role when it comes to mis and disinformation in the public sphere? And maybe along with that, if you want to, you could also explain what you think the issue is exactly with or disinformation in the public sphere. I'm just going to go ahead and choose basically you all in a row, and we'd just love to hear your thoughts on this for a few minutes. So let me start with Simone.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. Yeah, so actually, I wanted to start by kind of connecting to the past panel. So one of the two cases that were brought up was the woman who was arrested on the street in Massachusetts. And of course, we had the video, and the video was shared. And that was a very important piece of information for people to be able to make a judgment about. And the same goes for the man who was taken to El Salvador by mistake. And so these are two pieces of information that we ask ourselves, okay, are they reliable? How do we know? How are they being spread? And they're the basis, and they will continue to be the basis for a lot of political activity. So we have come to kind of take for granted the information that we have to make our judgments and our decisions. And I think it's not only that all democracies all the time need to have certain levels of information, but it's particularly important when things are really going on that require us to be very vigilant, to require us to have the knowledge, to know what's going on, when because I think this regime is actually doing a lot of things that I think, you know, many Americans, maybe the majority of Americans, would oppose. But that opposition is completely 100% dependent on them having the information. So information circulation and information guarantee and information security is an amazingly important thing that we have taken for granted. Now, of course, we are worried about it, and there's a lot of insecurity. What universities can do, I mean, I think universities have two roles. The first is just knowledge acquisition. That is the creation of knowledge. How much misinformation is there out there? Who's sending it? What's impact? I think actually we don't have good enough knowledge, and we need universities to have better knowledge about it. And the second is, as educators, I mean, universities have always sort of thought that our role is to, create critical thinkers. But I think in this day and age, with the questions of misinformation, that idea of a critical thinker has, added layers. That is not only being, internet literate, but also a kind of the virtue of accuracy. The virtue of accuracy means that you actually care, not just that you get information, but you go like one step further to make sure the information is good, or to double check, or to be, cognizant of the fact that there are information problems. And so the second role has to do with training students to realize the kind of information environment that they are living in 2025.
Thank you so much, Simone. Chris.
There we go. Had to unmute. Thank you. Yes, I certainly agree with what Simone just said. The role of higher education, this is obvious. I think it's an understatement to say it's a complex problem, complex phenomenon, and which is going to require, it's not a technical fix, it's not a legal fix, it's not an educational fix. You need to bring in so many different disciplines. The psychological sciences, the humanities, obviously information people, political scientists. It's a really, because it gets at all these different things. And because study of misinformation is not the study of what is true and what is false. That's what fact checkers might do. The study of misinformation is like, how does it work? What's the machinery like? What are information operations? Who's doing what? How does the technology provide or create affordances or tendencies for it to work in certain ways? And so it's a really complex thing. And I would think, the classical model might be that you have misinformation out there, and when you encounter it, then you form misinformed beliefs, and that leads to certain consequences and effects like polarization, lack of taking vaccines, whatever it might be. But even that model, I think we need to interrogate and question, because that implies that, well, first, if we can reduce the amount of misinformation out in the world, then we'll have less encountering of it. I think we've seen, and that was, I think, that our field was focused on that for quite a while by working with the social media platforms, for example, to try to curtail the spread of misinformation. Well, with X and then Facebook and Meta declaring that they're going to get out of the space of trying to bring some sort of moderation and scrutiny to these spaces, we're left with the problem where then it's up to individuals. Now, which leads to a second problem, though, is the classical model presumes that we're rational actors, that we all can, and that we can just then look, and it's based on this kind of, we have a skills deficit, and if we learn the skills, then we'll be able to detect. Well, that turns out not to be the case, because the reason people fall for misinformation is not due to a lack of skills, I would argue. I think it might be part of the issue, but it has to do with the psychology and emotions, wanting to signal that you're part of a group, the social norms of the communities within which you interact. There are lots of complex reasons why people may not just fall for misinformation, but actually choose to adhere to certain narratives because it serves some internal purpose, wanting to signal membership, wanting to figure out who to blame for your situation, or to avoid responsibility. It could be a whole host of other reasons. I mentioned this because, I think I want to say, because to problematize it and make it, because it is very complex, and that's exactly why universities need to have active roles in studying it from the multiple perspectives. Just as a footnote and I'll end, is the Center for an Informed Public, which I'm a part of and was helped start. We've now grown to over 40, maybe 50 people, and it's like 14 different units across campus including from faculty, students, and postdocs. So you really need to have those vibrant centers where people can, come into contact with people who have have perspectives and expertise that can be added to solving this problem.
Thanks, Chris. Mike.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you all, and I'm excited to talk with you all and learn from you and the folks in the Q&A too. I agree. I think this is fundamentally an interdisciplinary problem, and that, of course, requires interdisciplinary collaboration where people can learn from each other from humanistic and social scientific perspectives, from computational perspectives, from deep rhetorical perspectives. This is all really important. But I think that it's also worth mentioning that when things are fundamentally interdisciplinary problems, it often requires quite a bit of investment to bring these groups together and do sustained long-term work to try and tackle these problems. And we're in an environment now where the mechanisms that provide the sustained long-term intervention are under attack. And so this is really interesting environment where the folks studying misinformation are often now the targets of misinformation about the work that they do and why they do it and how they do it and all of that sort of thing. But I think it's really important for us to think about where mis and disinformation originates, how that might change. A lot of these things aren't durable. The sources of things that weren't true, that were shared a lot between people in 2016 were more likely to originate from Facebook, whereas in 2020 it was on email because Facebook engaged in more content moderation and monitoring of claims that were empirically verifiably untrue in 2020. Then they did less of that again in 2024, just as an example. So where it comes from is dynamic and changes a lot over time. How does it flow? What things are durable about the way things that aren't true flow across social media, conversation, different kinds of news and ideological outlets? What might be unique to the affordance of a platform or an AI tool? What is more durable and generalizable? What might be asymmetric about this in terms of the flow of content and people's responses to different kinds of misinformation correction? What should we do about misinformation is another big question. Is it important for universities to play a role in trying to correct it, in advocating for things that aren't true to be content moderated or taken down in some way? Is that appropriate? When might that be appropriate? Who should be in charge of making that decision is a really big question. What happens after misinformation is corrected? Some people no longer believe things that aren't true, and that might be good, but there's also empirical evidence that shows when people are exposed to fact checks and the fact checks are successful, they also deem the source of the fact check to be biased, which might affect the long-term credibility of that source doing that really important work of sharing the transparent and verifiable truth. I think, and then maybe the last thing I'll say for the moment is, it's also worth thinking about, and this is building a bit on what both Simone and Chris have said, correcting misinformation or finding ways to amplify things that are transparently and verifiably true is really difficult because academics aren't always dealing in the binary of is this true or is this false, but under what conditions is this true, under what conditions is this false, and the like. That is hard to understand publicly. It's hard to communicate for journalists with that kind of nuance. And even if we do a great job of that, this isn't a panacea for human decision making. People bring all kinds of things to the decisions they make that aren't at all related to the verifiable truth, even if they know and believe it. And so looking to misinformation researchers and practitioners who engage in fact-checking or observed correction and things like that is not the only thing that will help improve decision making of civil society more generally.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, just to kind of like pull on these threads a little bit with us all in common. I mean, I think we heard that, in terms of this need for democracies, in terms of being able to share information, to acquire knowledge, as Simone pointed out. And so overall, I think what I was hearing from you saying, I just wanted a chance to kind of see if there were any additional comments to this, is that potentially primarily you think that maybe the most important role for higher education is really just to understand it. And So I'm kind of asking it back to you. Would you agree with that? And then also, but that in addition to that, there does seem to be potentially these two other roles that you were mentioning as a group, like one, potentially when it comes to the training of students in terms of maybe a more proactive way and sort of understanding that information or misinformation, disinformation phenomenon. But the second one is this question of whether or not there is actually work to be done beyond just that simple understanding. And maybe you all have different opinions about what that role might be. Just to kind of maybe kick it off in reverse, I just would love to hear maybe Mike, if you have any thoughts.
I think it's important for scholars who want to contribute to this conversation to be free to do so. I don't think that every researcher who studies mis or disinformation or information flow or public knowledge or any of those sorts of things have an obligation necessarily to try and get into the weeds in the day-to-day, but many folks do try and do this. And I think it's useful for us to think about how that works. And so I think it's a little dangerous for researchers to be the go-to place to knock down claims that aren't true, because it's very difficult to have any one center or group of scholars to have the wide range of expertise you have to speak to everything. But I also think it's really valuable for folks to say, we're going to pay a lot of attention to, say, an election cycle and claims that major candidates are making and what we can tell you about the veracity of those claims, and here's how we know that. Doing that sort of thing in real time might be valuable, but then asking that same person to comment on HPV vaccines or a war in another country, is probably less useful, because it starts to stretch people's expertise in ways that might ultimately come back and be more negative. But I do think that those who want to do this, and our group wants to do this, we have a tool we call Chime In. Our goal is to amplify things that others have independently identified and have consensus upon that's true. We want to amplify those messages in social media spaces. Other folks have a more content moderation orientation, and I do think a multi-front attack is probably useful. And I think it's important, just to reiterate the first point I made, is that I don't think any one group should probably try to be the go-to team for all things misinformation. I think that's one area where we might get into a little bit of danger.
Chris.
Sure. I'd say another role are the designers, bringing in people who are going to design interventions that can be then tested, because we're trying to figure out what could work with different populations. In my own case, I do a lot of work right now building games and misinformation escape rooms. And I do this through kind of very participatory methods where we work with different communities to design games to see if that can help that particular community. Community could be from a country. I work with several countries, but also I work with the Fred Hutch, which is a cancer research and center in Seattle. And the problem they faced was that a lot of their patients who were in treatment were taking supplements or following kind of dietary advice that they were finding online that was interfering in their treatment. So that's a unique context, and that'd be like another point I think I would say is that context matters. I think when I think of, let's say, media literacy or information literacy skills, we think of it as a kind of universal set of skills about how to detect right from wrong and evaluate the sources. But these I think are very much contextually embedded in kind of people's daily lives and lived experiences. And so when a cancer patient is looking at information and trying to make a judgment of whether, many times it's just, they'll try it. I mean, first of all, they're in a different state of mind when they're looking at this, trying to find something that could be potentially helpful. Maybe not a cure, but maybe at least could help alleviate things or might be helpful. The question there is not whether it's right or wrong. In fact, when we talked to oncologists, the issue was it could be benign for them to do it, but depending on where they are in their treatment. So let's say if they're getting a chemotherapy regimen and they need to build up like say, a more have a protein-rich diet. Taking a diet that does not have that at that particular moment would be not helpful. It could interfere. But at other points in their journey, it could be helpful. So it's not these black and white things, but we have to meet, communities where they are and think about what their context is to make a difference. But anyway, I think to answer the question, I think we need to be in the business of not just understanding the phenomenon, which is extremely complicated and important for all the reasons that Mike and Simone have mentioned, but also taking that knowledge and trying to figure out what things can we do that will actually make a difference with the various populations out there that we care about.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Simone, and also I'll just throw into the mix too that I don't know if Simone wants to answer this or someone else later. Potentially there would be a different response related to this question if one were to focus on mis versus disinformation. So also interested in that potential response in terms of role. But anyway, Simone.
Well, actually, what I was going to say does address that. So I'm a political scientist, so I'm particularly interested in political disinformation. And so the difference between misinformation and disinformation usually is that misinformation is the more generic, general category for misleading or false information. And disinformation implies somebody actually has an intention to use this information for some purposes so that they put it into the information environment in order to produce some result. And we do see, of course, in politics, a lot of problems with misinformation. But one of the interesting things that scholars, not only in political science, but also in communication, are seeing is that the general population is very worried about mis and disinformation. So poll after poll after poll, some people call it a moral panic. People are really, really worried about it. But it turns out that it maybe not is as bad as we think. That is, it is, as Chris implied, it's clustered in communities. It's not as widespread as we think. And there is there is a certain popular narrative that it's everywhere and it's kind of undermining democracy. So one thing that we can do as scholars is to try to clear up, look, this is where it is, this isn't where it is, this is how it works, this kind of input, throughput, and output, where is it coming into, how is it moving in like social media, and what is its effect. But one of the problems with this as a political scientist is that it turns out that misinformation is not symmetrically spread across political positions. And so it's a fact. There's like very good evidence that there's more misinformation and disinformation on the conservative side of the spectrum than on the non-conservative or liberal side of the spectrum. And then what happens is that you have academic studies which identify this problem as being focused in political communities on the right, and then that research is being accused of being itself partisan, and so there's an attempt sometimes by elected officials to try to undermine and discredit that research. So what happens is that social science research is sucked into the partisan debate, even while it's trying to put forward scientific findings about misinformation, because the misinformation itself is generated by partisan and polarized politics. And here's where I would just disagree maybe with something that Chris said. I think there's really good evidence that misinformation does not cause polarization, that polarization causes misinformation, certainly in politics. Science and health are perhaps a different category, but in politics, it really looks to be that the causal arrow is polarization causes people to try to push certain types of narratives, misinformation narratives, in the information environment to further political goals. So one of the challenges for academics in trying to clear this up is that it's almost impossible to avoid being caught up in the partisan politics of it, because it is not it is asymmetrical in our political world, misinformation.
So Simone, your response actually is a perfect segue to where I would love to move this conversation, which is, what are the kinds of challenges that you all are seeing and in terms of fulfilling this role? And so certainly the one that you mentioned seems to be a large one. I know that you mentioned Chris, but I also have Mike maybe waving his hand at me in the background. So I just wanted to kind of leave the door open to either of you, Mike or Chris, in terms of, what are some challenges then you see in terms of fulfilling this role for universities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think there's lots of different ways to think about that. One of which is I think, Simone is quite right that a lot of the empirical research about the quote unquote effects of misinformation in terms of how many people really saw it and how many people were persuaded by it to make a decision that was different than they might have made otherwise. It seems to be pretty small. On the other hand, it's also the case that misinformation and disinformation can jump to other topics. So, for example, lots of people were worried in one way or another about the safety of the COVID vaccines. But now there's a growing number of people who aren't getting other routine vaccines, and we're seeing like a measles outbreak, as an example. And so we're seeing these kinds of things happening. So one thing that happens is that even if most people most of the time are not inundated with misinformation, they believe that they are. And what we see in our own surveys here at UW-Madison is that over time, from 2018 to today, every 2 years, we go into the field and ask a lot of repeated questions as well as things that are related to what's happening at the given moment. And one thing we found is that news avoidance is growing. Anxiety with respect to consuming news is growing. People feel overwhelmed by the information environment. And a lot of that is due to actual misinformation. And a lot of that is due to reporting and commentary about the volume of misinformation, which makes it harder for people to know what they can trust and easier for them to say, well, I should just not bother as compared to try and, go through and figure all those things out. So on one way to think about it in terms of challenges is just, it's really hard to estimate the effects of misinformation because we want to look at, did it affect vote choice and what people think is true, but it might also affect a host of other important behaviors indirectly. The other challenge is, as was pointed out, misinformation researchers are now often the targets of congressional investigations. Just speaking for myself, I was subpoenaed by the Weaponization of Government Subcommittee as part of a National Science Foundation grant for which I'm the principal investigator. We've had, tons of other kinds of inquiries from, federal lawmakers and state lawmakers. And it's not inappropriate for lawmakers to engage in oversight over money they spend, but it may well be inappropriate to make false claims about researchers, their motivations, the quality of their work without any evidence. And we're seeing a lot of that happen. And one of the purposes of that, to my way of thinking, is to chill the research from happening. And that's another big challenge, I think, is how do we get people interested in doing this work when many of those who do are under attack from very powerful sources.
First of all, Simone, I agree with you that the arrow points in that direction. That's what I was trying to say, but it obviously didn't come out very well. I agree with Mike. I was going to mention also the kind of the attacks on us and our along with Mike, our director in particular, Kate Starbird, has also been brought before that same committee. We've endured years worth of FOIA requests, and there have been other sorts of chilling, things that have happened that have really made it very difficult. However, interestingly, because we've been through that starting like a while ago, it almost feels like, okay, we've built up a bit of scar tissue and we can do this again. The biggest thing that helped was having our university behind us. That meant them telling us, we're going to protect you. It also meant we had to get legal counsel. We had to get support for how do we handle these FOIA requests. But because these things were both professional and personally challenging. Challenging is an understatement. That having the provost or the president say, we value it, we're going to support you, has made a tremendous amount of difference. And we can pass that on to our students and others so that they would feel that as well. We've also hired mental health professional because the work can be very disorienting, and you're getting into some kind of crazy stuff. And I think what makes this so challenging is it's not about little bits of information and whether a piece of information is true or wrong. It's about the narratives. It's about the broader stories. It's not whether you can take a lot of evidence and compose a fairly compelling story that has a kernel of truth or several kernels of truth in it, mixed with falsehoods, that provides this broader thing and that's why it's that's why it's also so insidious, because it's so once you take on a particular frame, then you start to see everything through that same frame, and it's the manipulation of the frames more than the pieces of information that I would argue has made this such a challenging and complex problem.
Connie, if I just really quickly, you'd kind of mentioned, about the university's role in this, and Chris's point, I think, is just so right on about support from universities. One thing I'd mention to add to it is that it's very difficult, even though it's really important, for universities to coordinate with each other. A lot of times, different kinds of inquiries or attacks are done on a number of places at once. And each place has an incentive to keep their head down and hope that some other university takes the brunt of the bad story or subpoena or what have you, instead of coordinating with each other. It's this big prisoner's dilemma where if everybody coordinated, it would be a lot easier to fight back. But if they don't coordinate, each kind of gets their own punishment meted out over different. It's the same thing that's happening to universities broadly now in the environment of the new administration. And there's the huge incentive to coordinate, but it seems to be very difficult to get going.
Like, I mean, I think maybe related to these challenges, I guess, as part of this, then, to what extent is this a problem related to the decline of trust and expertise, I guess, from your perspectives? I don't know if potentially Simone has something to add there. I mean, so for example, if we have the public sphere where there is misinformation, disinformation, floating about, very hard to distinguish in terms of the public sphere. Universities are struggling to try to even understand this, and sometimes being attacked for it, even as they try to understand the phenomenon. What part of this has to do with expertise and trust?
So I want to jump in on 2 points. So the first, the United States has a long history of being kind of suspicious of experts. So I was just looking up, there's the famous book from the 1960s, Richard Hofstadter, which is The Anti-Intellectualism of American, or Americans' Anti-Intellectualism or something. So there's this long tradition of anti-intellectualism, but originally it's rooted in kind of, the common man and a certain type of egalitarianism, and we can all do it, and I'm just as good as you. And so that kind of, but now we're seeing something new. So that has had a long tradition in American culture and also in American politics. But now we seem to be seeing something new, and it's getting mixed up in a lot of things. So, for example, the present administration's attack on universities. Part of it, what one might think, is just a kind of general undermining of experts. But one of the things that's happening is that it has to do with, so the administration's gutting of the bureaucracy is partly about having loyalists and friends in there, as opposed to experts, people whose priority is to support the regime, as opposed to the priority of pursuing the truth. And universities just have never, generally speaking, first on the political, but generally their priority is truth and not loyalty to a regime or loyalty. And so part of the attack at the university right now is a kind of payback, or it's punishment, because Trump and the administration knows that universities generally are not a place that are going to be favorable to them. Not just because, generally speaking, universities are center-left as opposed to center-right, but also because the priority is truth and knowledge, and not other kinds. So there is a hostility towards the universities right now, a political hostility towards expertise in the pursuit of truth, but it's not like this older hostility towards intellectualism and academics and people with PhDs. In Germany, you have a PhD and they call you, Herr Doctor Professor, and you put you have a little plaque that's usually on your apartment, on your house, right? You advertise. And in the United States, nobody asks you when you have the drop-down menu of, it's Mr. or Mrs. and there's no professor or Herr Doctor Professor or, so there's something kind of positive and egalitarian about some of Americans' anti-intellectualism, but I think the context now is really completely different.
I don't know, Mike or Chris, if you have any thoughts to additionally add. I mean, I've been kind of, how do I say this? Like, it's actually been a question that I've been mulling for a long time, personally myself. When I was still on the academic track and it was training to be a historian, actually, I was focused on East Germany, and so I was able to collect actually this very old book printed during the East German regime, which was like, why do the experts why can experts, or how can experts be wrong, right? So sort of trying to kind of understand sort of the relationship about how should one sort of view it when, there are times, right, that we know of when expertise fails and fails pretty astoundingly. So I guess one of these questions I have right now is that, in terms of very large questions that are before us right now, say with vaccines that have been mentioned, also, obviously, like election results, we'll be seeing how that goes in the next couple of cycles as well. What is the way that we would ideally want right now for the public to be interacting with universities when it comes to the sort of understanding of like expertise?
I'm gonna first answer this in one way, then as Simone said rightly, the problem of spreading political misinformation is very asymmetrical, right? It is coming from the populist right. On the receiver end, in terms of who's vulnerable to misinformation, it turns out to be that we're all vulnerable to misinformation. And that's because we're all humans. We all have biases, we all have our priors, we all have emotions that can be triggered in one way or another. And we all have our frames, right? So if I come in with a frame that big pharma cannot be trusted, or that hedge funds are inherent, are evil enterprises, I'm going to be looking at evidence, information in a particular way because I have those biases. And that's just being human. So it's also important for people in the public to know that this is not a problem only of the, yes, the political misinformation is overwhelmingly coming from the populist right. But misinformation can affect all of us, and you can be anywhere. And I study misinformation in very non-political contexts. I talked about health. We've also worked with K-pop fandom communities, and that's a fandom community, global fandom community. They're very passionate about what's going on with their band and the members. And there's lots of rumors and misinformation going on. And it's not a political thing at all, but it is important to those people. So I think for one thing for the public to know is that this is, don't just point the finger at the other side in terms of, don't think that only they are susceptible to misinformation. It's only people who are less educated or less whatever. We're all susceptible to misinformation, and having a little bit of that understanding could help start to build some understanding of the problem of that. we can see someone else how they may have fallen into believing a conspiracy theory or something else. If you understand that you yourself are also prone to that.
Yeah, I think just a quick follow-up on the humility point. I think it's worth it for scientists to also be thinking really carefully about what elements of their research about misinformation or disinformation or the flow of these kinds of things or the uptake of these kinds of things or the origins of these kinds of things. Like we have lots of expertise in those areas, and we can show you who's susceptible to these kinds of things, who spreads these kinds of things, how they spread differently on different platforms or different kinds of news organizations with pretty good accuracy and replication. And then what the natural question is, what should we do about it? And now we're getting over the edge of our expertise. If we've identified the misinformation and how it spreads and who's spreading it and who's susceptible to it and all that sort of thing, it's very tantalizing to say, and here's what the public policy should be now because of it. But we don't really know whether those things are going to work. Is it better to take the content down? Is it better to correct it? Is it better to have a community note correct it? Is it better to have an expert correct it? Is it better to have an independent journalist? These are all big questions, and which of those things can be policies? Can they be policies on a social media platform? Could they be policies that a state or federal government would pass? These are all big questions that sometimes scientists are too willing to speculate about with certitude. While I think I'm more worried about the attacks on researchers doing this work, I also think it's valuable for us to think about the limits of what we ought to be recommending.
So I do agree. So first of all, I do agree on epistemic humility, absolutely. And I also agree with Chris that everybody to some extent is susceptible to misinformation. However, I do want to press the point about political misinformation, because there really seems to be evidence that, or let me start another way. So I guess one of the ways I think of combating misinformation is when you have multiple sources of information. And so one of the ways that people get stuck in misinformation is when they're in echo chambers or they have a very closed information environment. And there is really pretty good evidence that people actually choose their information environments. And so what happens is that people want to just stick with this one narrative, or they don't want to hear other stories. And that does happen in some groups more than others, and it just does happen on the right more than the left. I think it is true that we should all think of ourselves as susceptible, but it turns out that people used to think that, oh, everybody who's on the internet are in these echo chambers. But actually, it turns out that we have very porous information environments. We get information from all sorts of different sources. And most of the time, we have just a tiny bit of it is about politics. But it's just hard when you're on all these different apps. You just get a lot of information, and you actually have to make an effort to close yourself off, to be in an echo chamber and to only hear the stories you want to hear. And there are very particular groups that do that, and they are on the right. And so, although I do, as I say, I think that epistemic humility and thinking that we're all susceptible is true, but it's a political problem. It is a political partisan problem. It really is. The evidence is pretty clear.
So, I mean, actually just taking, whether it's Simone's examples or some of Mike's and Chris's that you shared, I guess, I mean, given all of these different circumstances, what does it actually mean to advance this kind of conversation then with the public? Like, is there a conversation to advance with the public then? If there is supposed to be a role basically that the universities are playing with regards to the understanding of disinformation? I'm just curious to know, like, clearly there's does seem to be issues in terms of, to some extent, trust, to some extent, maybe it's even simple understanding. And I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about what universities or researchers could be doing or need to be doing, or maybe they don't need to be doing in terms of advancing the conversation with the public.
I always like to jump in. So I think when we haven't talked about the media. And so I actually do think that there is a problem in the way in which the media covers misinformation. And I think that has to do with misinformation sells. That is, citizens are very worried about misinformation. They really are. And so there is a tendency towards sensationalism in the media and a failure really to take seriously the empirical research that's going on in universities. So I would like to see journalists and the media really start looking at some of this evidence and some of this research and incorporating it into their coverage of misinformation, as opposed to always looking for the sensational stories and always kind of pushing this idea that we're heading into some terrible dystopia of post-truth.
Chris.
One of the things that we did when we set up our Center for an Informed Public is we made a very strong commitment to public facing and public engaging with the public in many ways. So several of us, and myself included, do a lot of community engaged research. So we're working with communities, libraries, journalists, and others, not just to translate our work for them, but actually as part of the process of coming up with the research questions, coming up with ways to test or to study whatever the research question might be. And as I mentioned earlier, to come up with interventions, things that could make a difference in a small kind of contained space to see if something is working or not. We've also, so we have lots of examples of kind of community engaged research that involves different aspects of the public. We also do lots of public programming. We have something called Misinfo Day, which we put on once a year. And we also then support schools from across the country to be able to put them on in their schools. And we've worked with journalists, kind of our election integrity partnership with Stanford and others was really to help produce rapid response research around the 2016 and then the 2020 election. They're basically data memos trying to look at, where did this thing come from? How did it spread? What was the timeline? Who were the influencers involved in it? Who amplified it? So that journalists could have a richer kind of evidence-based resource to go to when they were creating their stories. So I think there's many ways that we also have partnered with our public radio station and done a lot of series, a lot of speaking series and Q&A and activities with the public radio station. So I think there's many ways that we can get involved with the public that can be creative, that's genuine, it's bidirectional, all those things that are going to be, I think, healthy for everybody. It's also, I think, for being a person who's very much of an adherent to this type of these participatory methods, I think it's invaluable to have them as partners in the research so that we can learn about their lived experiences and produce interventions and that could make a difference in their communities.
Yeah, I'll just co-sign onto that. The center I direct here, the Center for Communication and Civic Renewal, is funded by a very similar Grant for the Night Foundation that the center Chris is referring to at the other UW is funded by, and we just do a ton of scholarship, public-facing reporting of that, publicly oriented conferences, tons of news media interviews, local, state, and national, trying to train students, provide undergraduate students research opportunities and communication opportunities to share what we do. These are things that like lots of individual faculty or research teams like to do. But your question about universities, I think we should at least demand more aggressively of our universities that they need to be promoting this work more aggressively. And I think it speaks to Simone's point about news organizations are terribly constrained under shrinking newsrooms and tight deadlines. And it is very easy to tell dramatic stories with these, kind of claims that Simone was talking about. And if you're on a tight deadline with not a lot of people to help you with your story, that's the kind of thing you want to do. And so here is a place where a university can fill that information vacuum and say, here's stuff that experts are learning about what's happening. And not only are we learning it, but then we can communicate it in a way that highlights it's building iteratively on what we know. It's not magically changing the world immediately, it's adding to something. I think that will help people. This is a long-term project to help people recognize that discoveries that researchers make, whether it's in the world of misinformation or vaccine development or antibiotic development or Alzheimer's treatment, all these kinds of things are iterative, even though they're often reported as earth-shattering. And if universities do a more aggressive job of promoting the work, even when it highlights partisan asymmetries, even when it highlights other kinds of things that might leave universities open to attack from those who don't like the fact that universities exist, it's something that they need to do a better job of to help the researchers who are trying to do this stuff get their work out there to folks so that they can engage with it and decide how they want to incorporate that information into how they live their lives.
Thanks so much, Mike. And let me just take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists. Unfortunately, we didn't have a chance to move to some of the really great questions in the Q&A session, but potentially we can try to see if someone can address these questions later on through today. But I think also all of our panelists are available for future, like further information or answering of questions if you contact them via their emails, which are available online. So yes, thank you so much, Simone, Mike, and Chris for sharing your expertise with us today. Now we're just going to help kick off the next session. I'd like to introduce Cameron Beatty, a current fellow with the center. Cameron is an associate professor in the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies Department at Florida State University. And Cameron is here to share a little bit about the center's fellowship program and introduce a short video about the work regarding the current center fellows.
Thanks so much, Connie. So I'm just really excited to be here in all the conversations that we've had. As stated, I'm a member of the current 2024-25 Fellows class for the UC Center for Freedom of Speech and Civic Engagement. And one of the cornerstones of the center is our National Fellows Program. Each year, the center selects fellows from a broad range of disciplines and backgrounds, such as law, higher education, social science, and government. And fellows receive funding to conduct research that furthers the national conversation related to expression and democratic participation on college campuses. And it's been a pleasure to learn and grow and to actually find thought partners with folks that are beyond my discipline and thinking critically about free expression, especially during these times when free expression is under attack for so many. So I'm pleased to introduce you to the 2024-25 cohort of Center Fellows and the important work we are doing.
Each year, the Center selects a cohort of fellows through a competitive process. Center Fellows receive funding to complete research about critical, cutting-edge issues related to expression and democratic engagement on college and university campuses. Fellows have diverse backgrounds and expertise. They include scholars, librarians, policymakers, practitioners, and administrators. Their research projects are aimed at impacting campus stakeholders, students, staff, faculty, law enforcement, and others, all of whom are navigating the treacherous landscape of expression and academic freedom in this moment. We're excited to present their work to you this summer, followed by a series of interactive Fellows in the Field digital workshops. In the meantime, let's hear from them about their projects and why these issues are important to higher education and to our democracy. Navigating expression, understanding the impact of anti-DEI and anti-CRT legislation on campus civic engagement.
So I'm hoping that my project helps us better understand how students are engaging with the legislation, how they're understanding the legislation, how it impacts student organizations and student organization leaders, and then what information or misinformation do we need to dispel around these legislations so it can have a meaningful, impactful understanding of how students civically engage during their undergraduate career.
From Capitol to Campus, a practitioner's toolkit for protecting academic freedom in the face of state and federal challenges.
I aim to help those in academia and those in the general public who are supportive of free speech and academic freedom on how to better advocate at both their state and federal government. The reality is there is a major disconnect on how to advocate to legislative officials and their staff. My goal is to utilize my years of experience, my connections throughout state and federal government, and provide an easily utilized toolkit to improve advocacy.
Bridging Gaps, AI Empowerment for Students of Color Against Political Misinformation.
Both the 2020 and 2024 elections highlighted the increasing sophistication of misinformation campaigns, targeting communities of color, leveraging language barriers, mistrust in voting systems, and pre-existing fears. In addition to that, the rise of artificial intelligence has magnified the threats to free expression and civic engagement.
Good faith speech, exploring meaning-making and tensions in free speech practices on Catholic universities.
There are, depending on who you ask, about 200 Catholic colleges, universities in the United States, and each of them have a very different perspective and take on how speech and expression exist on their campus. And we thought it was really important for us to examine some of the differences, but also to take this opportunity to build community within these universities, to examine how are professionals engaging with each other and engaging with their mission when making kind of policy and practice decisions at their institution.
We thought that recent events especially made this a really good and timely project, as Catholic institutions in particular really explicitly highlight the spiritual dimension of a student as really essential to their formation.
No shame in speaking. Resources for navigating emotions on campus.
So I do research on shame, which I define as this really consuming and often really painful self-conscious emotion that's characterized by really negative self-judgment. When you feel the negative weight of self-judgment or of judgment from others, often towards your identity, your ideas, or even your words, it can actually become impossible to speak, impossible to participate. Shame can also be very taboo. It's something that we don't always like to talk about. So in discussing it and bringing it out into the open, I see one strategy to sort of do the opposite, to bring more voices and more diverse perspectives into conversation, really aiming again to surface shame, to find more ways to talk about these hard feelings.
The Free Speech Movement at 60, Reflections on Campus Free Speech 1964-2024.
I think there's just generally been a devaluing of freedom of speech, and it's really important for people to understand the history of free speech, that the free speech rights that we have were won through hard-earned struggle, in fact, by students in many cases. Like the free speech movement is a good example of that. There to be more knowledge out there on why we should value free speech and why you should value free speech from someone who you don't even agree with. In fact, somebody you think has awful ideas. Now, I'll say this, that it's okay to ask tough questions and to make it really clear that you don't like this speaker. That's your free speech right too. But too often these days, we have bad models of people shutting down people they don't agree with.
Information literacy in democratic institutions, connecting academic and school librarians.
My project is about connecting high school and college level librarians, so connecting librarians in democratic institutions. And also it is about doing that in the context of our current political climate, with many challenges to free speech and academic freedom.
The promise and perils of interpartisan friendships for fostering democratic learning and reducing values-based polarization on campus.
My project involves understanding college students' stories of friendship across political differences. And I'm conducting this project in collaboration with another fellow, Alyssa Rockenbach. So we're seeking to provide insight into the factors that facilitate and motivate college students to build and sustain these interpartisan friendships. And we'll be developing a toolkit to translate what we've learned from student stories into concrete guidance and recommendations for student affairs educators, faculty, senior administrators, and also for students themselves.
Our project with the center is enabling us to really explore the stories of college students who are reaching across political differences in their friendships. And so we're learning from them how their friendships came to be, how they remain close amidst the differences that they have, and importantly, how their college campuses are playing a part in helping them to develop those friendships and sustain them in the long term.
Democratic erosion and the contemporary assault on education and knowledge.
So my project examines how recent efforts targeting higher education are related to or brought in, and what are the ways in which they're related to broader concerns about the state of democracy in the United States. And so what I wanted to do was sort of think about ways in which these parallel challenges are connected to each other, and in particularly thinking about it through the lens of, as a legal scholar, to know how what's the legal architecture of the contemporary assault on knowledge in its various manifestations, and then drawing connections to the wider concerns about democratic erosion.
Oh, well, I just think the center is really a great institution because it brings together people from all kinds of fields and all kinds of interests to talk about, not just free speech, but also the civic engagement part. Like, how do we get young people especially to care and to see citizenship as an active thing?
I've really valued the fellowship so far this year, and I've especially valued the variety of perspectives people bring to the program. And it's been one of the more rewarding highlights of my professional career in recent years to be a part of this center.
To learn more about the center and the work of our fellows, visit us at freespeechcenter.universityofcalifornia.edu.
Hello, my name is Melanie Zeman, and I am the Communications and Program Associate at the Center. I just want to thank Cameron and our other fellows for giving us a taste of the impactful work that they've been conducting over this past year. There's also a link in your chat where you can see more about their work. Before I pass the mic to our incredible final panel, I want to take the opportunity to share a little bit about some of the other programs and initiatives that the center works on. It is my honor to oversee the center's Valuing Open and Inclusive Conversation and Engagement, or VOICE initiative, which gives up to $5,000 in funding to University of California students, staff, or faculty who conduct a project that furthers free expression, civic engagement, or democratic learning at UC. I'm excited to share that applications for our next cohort of VOICE recipients will be opening this coming Tuesday, April 15th. Keep an eye out for that. It also wouldn't be a Speech Matters conference without a shameless plug for the center's monthly podcast, Speech Matters, which features Michelle in conversation with other thought leaders tackling the most pressing issues impacting free expression and democracy on campus and beyond. We encourage you to scan the QR code that you see on your screen and subscribe to the podcast. This past month, we were joined by 2 current UC student regents who shared about their experiences in student leadership during the last year of protests. You can also get the podcast on your favorite podcast player. Now we turn to our final panel, taking the temperature of speech on campus. Until the November election, campuses were largely consumed by conversations and controversies about protest, time, place, and manner rules, and institutional neutrality, with many institutions rethinking and rewriting their policies. Since President Trump has returned to office, the focus has changed. Now the federal government is using the events of the last year to justify funding cuts, investigations, and litigation against colleges and universities. There's no one better to steward us through this morass than our esteemed moderator, Sarah Brown, the senior editor at the Chronicle for Higher Education. Since she joined the Chronicle as a reporter in 2015, Sarah has written about Title VI, Title IX, I'm misreading my Roman numerals, sorry, apologies, and how colleges are handling sexual assault and harassment, and whether higher ed is really committed to racial equity, mental health struggles, and academics. Sarah, I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melanie. And hello, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm Sarah Brown. I'm a senior editor here at the Chronicle of Higher Education. And as Melanie kind of alluded to, the initial vision for this panel was conceived before we really had a sense of what the Trump administration's agenda for higher education would be and how it was going to manifest. And so we are going to kind of have this conversation in two parts. We're going to address, what has happened on college campuses in terms of protest and speech policies since the spring 2024 Gaza protests, which obviously rocked the nation, rocked higher education a year ago. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the current state of campus free speech, in this moment under the Trump administration when, people are genuinely really experiencing harm as a result of expressing their opinions, and especially international students and undocumented students right now. And so I just want to acknowledge that off the top. But I'm thrilled to be here with a great panel. We have Miguel Angel Hernandez. He is the Associate Vice President for Student Life and Dean of Students at San Francisco State University. We have Mary Rose Papandrea, Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, also my alma mater, go Tar Heels. And we have Kristen Shaverdian, Program Director of Campus Free Speech at Penn America. Thanks to all of you for being here. So I'm going to get us started by having us go back to kind of what happened a year ago when pro-Palestinian protests really rocked the nation. And we have an actual campus administrator here who had to respond to those protests. And so I think that really helps set the table for our discussion today. But, what does campus speech and protest actually look like? So Miguel, can you just take us back to sort of what your experience was? You had students who were protesting and calling for, divestment from Israel, calling for various other things. What was your experience? How did you sort of manage that? Tell us more.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to share a bit of our story. One of the things I'll share with you all to get us started is just know that throughout the process, I think engaging with our community was the center of our focus and work. And so listening to what our students wanted to do, being able to attend and engage and listen to what our students envisioned for their response on our campus was powerful. And then finding ways to make sure that we were able to position ourselves to support our students' engagement was powerful. I think we did that through relationship and through collaboration. And that's the story that I'd like to make sure that I highlight throughout this piece. The collaboration happened in relationship with administrators, faculty members, staff. It happened with community members. It happened with our students as well. And so it was, to me, a very powerful opportunity to come together as a community and focus on the things that would help our students engage in their First Amendment constitutional rights on campus, while at the same time allowing the university to continue its mission to maintain its operations, if you will, keep the community at large safe, keep our students engaging in freedom of expression safe, and also not disrupt the classroom experiences that were happening around the experience. And so I think I'll stop there and just share that the collaboration, the way that the community came together, the way that the community was able to listen, engage, and maintain dialogue throughout the experience is a highlight and helped us manage the experience well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Miguel. And just to sort of fill people in of what actually happened at San Francisco State. I mean, there were at more than 100 colleges across the country, there was an encampment, there were demands being made. And San Francisco State actually, some months later ended up making a change to investment policies, right? Can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. Yes, our students did make a decision collectively to establish an encampment. We had over 100 tents on campus, outdoors in our quad. We also had over 200 folks engaging in supporting the encampment throughout that experience. And for multiple days, I think it was something like 17 to 20 days that we were supporting our students in that experience. And yes, I think that the encampment itself was powerful in terms of being able to establish communication with our students through faculty relationships and through faculty advisors that were guiding the students in this process. I think one of the things that happened that will lead to your specifically your question that I describe as one of the most inspiring moments of engagement as an administrator in my 25 years in the profession was that our university president, our university vice president, and our provost agreed to meet with our students in a public forum to discuss their concerns, their demands, what they wanted to see. They did this in the quad, in our plaza, at the Student Center. There were over 500 people in attendance, and it was powerful to witness a moment, a conversation in such a public space where you could hear a pin drop with that many people in attendance. It was throughout the process, I believe that we were able to engage in a way that truly highlighted the administrative process, if you will. Students engaged in expressing their concerns. The campus listened, and the campus negotiated and engaged in efforts to address concerns. And so what happened after the meeting with the president, the provost, and our vice president, the conversation shifted. Our students agreed to end the encampment with the understanding that they were invited to continue engaging in conversations with the president, our vice president for advancement, and our foundation to explore concepts, not concepts, to explore opportunities really related to three things, I think. One, transparency, making sure that the university's investments were clear and easy to understand, not just difficult reports, if you will, that takes a degree to understand and decipher, but making it more plain for the community to be able to absorb. Creating a website so that information could be shared. Things related to also looking at what is the university's investments tied to, and looking at anything related to weapons manufacturing. And so those were the things that the students were able to engage in conversation with our president. And that is not very different than the work that our students have engaged in at San Francisco State for years. And so other areas of the campus had been in those conversations prior to the encampment of last spring. And this just allowed us to continue engaging our community in that work to arrive at the resolutions that they did.
Miguel, when you were talking about that public forum at the plaza, I was thinking in that moment, like, this is an example of speech working as intended. This is exactly what we, especially on a public university campus must uphold the First Amendment. This is the kind of thing that you want to be happening on a college or university campus. What I want to be clear that what San Francisco State has done, related to managing the encampment on their campus, as well as endorsing some changes to investments, that is uncommon. We actually at the Chronicle covered San Francisco State's efforts because they stood out. And the ways that they responded to their students and the ways that they handled sort of the aftermath were uncommon. I think, Kristen, you can speak to this because you've been looking at speech and responses from campuses and policies all over the country. And, frankly, what we saw a year ago was, the images stick in your minds of, police officers, coming to campus and, throwing students and protesters to the ground and arresting them en masse. I think I'm curious as you think about sort of what happened after the spring 2024 protest, there was this sort of clampdown, right, where it seemed like a lot of campuses wanted to change their protest policies and say, oh, that was chaotic. We don't want that to happen again. What have you kind of seen? What did you see as this academic year got underway? in terms of the sort of state of campus speech and the policies around it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me here. Really looking forward to this. And I will dive right into that in a moment, but I also want to say it was so wonderful to hear, Miguel, your story. And I agree, it's one of those rare stories that we've also tried to really learn from. And I want to pull out one really important thread, which was that the continuation, that building that community and those relationships don't happen during crisis, but they're already in place, right? And so like your ability and your campus's ability to be able to have those conversations and everything you were able to do, how that really, it's seeded before the crisis. And I know it's something that I talk about a lot, and I think it's just wanted to highlight that because I think it's so important. And then to pivot to your question specifically, Sarah, about the kind of the changes that happened after. And yeah, I think there were plenty of news coverage, and we talked about ourselves at Penn America about how, especially in that sort of going back to school time, there was a lot of changes in policy that some were phrasing as tightening restrictions around type, place, and manner specifically, and then others framed as clarifications. And, I think often they may have done both, right? And so I actually was looking back to prepare for today to a Chronicle article from September and talked about how, there were about over 3,000 arrests across campus. And that in response to that, we saw a lot of restrictions around encampments, around masking, amplification, having to register in advance for events and activities, stronger, I would say, repercussions or consequences, right? A tightening around what the ramifications would be for breaking any policies. And at times these policy changes may have happened, or clarifications may have happened with input, but quite often they didn't. So we definitely saw instances, and this happened throughout the spring also, where a policy may have been changed quite quickly without input from, say, faculty, or without, gathering other members of the community together. And so students and others went back to campus in the fall with kind of this new wave across many campuses. And I will say, with that sort of 10,000-foot view, right, that I have, because I talked to a lot of people across a lot of different campuses, that there was to a large measure, what was seen as efforts by administrations to, in fact, whether they call them clarifications or not, to really tamp down and protest specifically. And so I have heard from administrators who had said, hey, we changed our policies. Isn't it great that we have no more protests on our campus? And I just think that really speaks to, I think, a bigger question of what do we want our campuses to look like? What does it mean to be engaged in free expression and dialogue and community? Miguel mentioned this word of kind of safe spaces, and how do we mean that word, right? I would argue there is a way that we can approach the spaces on campus where safety can still look like dialogue happening, can still look like people across multiple viewpoints, multiple identities, able to engage in that. I think that does take a lot of work, but I would argue that work is not simply enforcing stronger and tighter policy restrictions across campus.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kristen. And I think, as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the, frankly, more extreme cases of policy changes that we did see it take effect this academic year. And I mean, I can think of, several campuses where, you had to register your protest, 3 days in advance, 4 days in advance. There was one campus where it was like, you have to register it like 2 weeks, multiple weeks in advance, right? And it's like, that is clearly at odds with how activism and protests even work, how sort of campuses even operate. And, and at the same time, you do understand, like, right, and Miguel even spoke to this, like, there do need to be rules, like, there do need to be ways to preserve, like, the ability to hold classes, the ability for the university to basically, continue with its operations, to have students learn and faculty teach and do research, et cetera. So, Mary Rose, I'm curious if, with the legal perspective that you have here, how should we be thinking about, when it comes to higher education? A lot of colleges have, for example, banned encampments. Miguel actually mentioned, in the spring of 2024, they did, like, for at least a period, they did allow the encampment to be there, and then, negotiated with the students, and then they voluntarily dispersed. There were sort of different approaches across the board last spring, where some encampments were allowed to be there, some were not. And I'm curious what the legal obligations are for colleges when it comes to something like an encampment or a really disruptive protest, right? I mean, again, you want to allow free expression to the extent that it is possible. But then if students are like, one example from last fall, they're going into a job fair and, like, disrupting a job fair and, like, shouting and et cetera. And, like, that job fair was not able to continue because of what happened. And what are the legal implications here? Maybe you could speak to both, for public institutions as well as private institutions.
Well, sure. I mean, I think one thing the universities found themselves getting in trouble with is that they weren't enforcing their rules consistently. And we saw, cries across the political spectrum saying you're treating these protesters with kid gloves, allowing their speech to flourish, not enforcing your rules in a viewpoint neutral manner. So I think this audience understands viewpoint neutrality. That's a very central part of the First Amendment. You can't treat some speakers better than others. And so I think one thing the universities found is that when they were trying to allow some protests, because they may have thought that's part of the college experience to have robust discourse on their campuses, and they didn't want, and this, I'm speaking in generalities. You had many campuses not wanting to, like, send in the police right away and allowing some speech to flourish. But at some point, you find they're not enforcing the rules even-handedly, and that leads to legal problems. So you can't allow the pro-Palestinian speakers to speak and have freedom to encamp and so on, and then not allow students of a different viewpoint to do the same exact thing. So that's a big problem. So I think a lot of the schools were finding they needed to have rules, first of all, because some schools were finding they didn't actually have policies on the books that apply to the situations that were arising. They may not even have a rule about camping. They may not have a rule about projected images on a building and that sort of thing. And so they needed to adopt those rules. And then they found they really needed to enforce those rules even-handedly to avoid legal problems. And then as a practical matter, I think we saw, and again, the experience differed widely around the country, but in some instances, campuses, we'll just pick on Columbia, poor Columbia, but they let things get a little out of control, a lot out of control, where then it became very difficult, and they became a political punching bag. And I just want to mention that in the course of this panel, to ignore, we can't ignore the political context of what was happening. We were in an election year, and we saw the universities were being used as pawns and very successfully by conservatives in the, among many other factors, but it was very much part of the election. So we see universities not just having legal issues, but and we're going to be getting more into this. Like, you can have a lot of the law on your side, but when you have competing demands coming from your board of trustees and your donors and your faculty and your students, and then state universities from the legislature, and now we see the federal government, it's very hard to worry about legal niceties. You have much bigger existential problems.
That's a great point, Mary Rose. I think, because a lot of at least we'll get into this, right? But the federal government's actions of the last few months have mostly been targeted at private universities, right? Too. And so that's sort of really important here, and explicitly targeted at private universities for speech, right? I mean, that is ultimately what we're talking about. Miguel, I want to go back to you and on that question of, enforcing new policies. San Francisco State did have to clarify some things. It wasn't like, a big overhaul. I remember we talked, it was sort of a change, maybe not in practice, but or not in the letter of the policy, but sort of in how you were carrying it out. So can you say more about how San Francisco State sort of changed its approach a little bit and how
Sure.
that's sort of played out this academic year?
Sure. And thank you. Yes. And to just add a little bit to Mary Rose's piece, I so appreciate what you were sharing in terms of the enforcement of or the carrying out or administering of policies that exist. Let me just quickly share that at San Francisco State, we have had a time, place, and manner policy for 18 years prior to the encampment happening. And most of the CSU institutions in our system, all 23 schools, had a version of a time, place, and manner policy as well. And the encampment piece was not allowed prior to our encampment of this past spring, and that's in the policy, right? And so I just want to share that and as we met previously, you all know that language is very important to me, and so I don't want to mislead or misrepresent that at San Francisco State University, it wasn't that we allowed an encampment to occur. It was that we were responding to choices that students gathered and spontaneously created, right? And it's not that we didn't think it was coming. We were watching what was happening across the country. But the concept of allowing something that works against your policy is not what happened at San Francisco State. I will share that what I witnessed and what I participated in as an administrator, supporting my president, my vice president, my provost, and the faculty and students on our campus, was really we were responding and working throughout that period of time to find peaceful resolution. And we did clarify that in the time, place, and manner policy we had, taking over a building or occupying a building or engaging in protest inside of a building would not be permissible. Our community understood that and received that message and worked with us within their version of reason. I think we were able to stay out of academic buildings so that we wouldn't disrupt the academic mission of the university. But being inside was not an option. And so I just wanted to address the piece of, or the word allowed. It wasn't that San Francisco State allowed an encampment to happen. It was that we were aggressively and daily connecting with students to see how can we resolve what can we agree to so that we can keep everyone safe, address your concerns, and end this encampment peacefully. In terms of the policy itself, I love the title of our conference that we're participating in. The word trust stands out, and I want to start with that in terms of responding specifically to your question. And so at the system level, there was as I mentioned, we have had versions of time, place, and manner policies for many years. What we did see happen post the encampment period was that our system looked at versions of all of our 23 institutions' time, place, and manner policies and pulled together a system policy. And the shift for us was that we no longer were going to move forward with, we adopted a system-wide policy that pulled promising practices from all of our institutions into one policy. And so the things that we saw in the new policy were practices that maybe we did not use before because it was something that came from another campus. But the word trust that I'm connecting this idea to is important because I think that when we discuss having 23 different approaches in a system to policy or to supporting freedom of expression, free speech of our communities, that can create lack of trust, right? And so now moving forward, not that it necessarily has been rolled out with this concept in mind, right? But this is what we're using on our campus to say, it actually, to me, strengthens the conversation to say we have a shared policy. The policy comes to life through the administration and through the community and how we engage with said policy. And then for us, it gives us the opportunity to hopefully trust a little bit more that we have more consistency in how we work through an engagement like a protest, an encampment, things of that nature in the future. And so I wanted to share that piece, that we have had policies within our system for more than a decade at most campuses, for us more than 18 years. And what we have shifted to is honoring the system-wide policy, educating, communicating, sharing with faculty, staff, students what this system-wide policy looks like, what's embedded in it, how we will carry those pieces out and honor the policy, right? And honor our community as well, while at the same time, the education, the communication pieces, but also making sure that students understand that we are still in an environment where freedom of expression, freedom of speech is going to be supported. And here are the pieces we need to agree to as a community. And those continue to be not disrupting the academic or the educational mission of the university, and not disrupting the business of the university itself, if that makes sense. So I hope that helps a little bit answer the question of what shifted or what changed in the policy, and what I believe are the benefits to having a system-wide policy that allows the institutions to move forward.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel. And I think what you spoke to, sort of, you wanted to sort of clarify, we did not allow an encampment. We responded to it when it came up, and we were able to respond, we think, pretty effectively. I think that really speaks to some of the differences we saw in how different institutions did respond to the protests of last spring. And there were quite a few institutions that did not manage things like you did. They called the police onto campus to manage the situation, and in many cases arrest people. I did want to just briefly sort of address that. Kristen, do you have, I'm curious what, as again, you're looking sort of across the country, there were, as I said before, those were kind of the images, the police coming to campuses that kind of stuck in people's minds. Do you have any concerns about sort of how many institutions kind of turn to law enforcement to like manage some of these campus protests, campus expression? Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, right? Seeing the images, we were watching like many people to see that sometimes students were just gathered for a short amount of time on some campuses before the police were called. Sometimes the police were on horse, and there were these really strong images, right, of police above protesters, taking down faculty or staff. And also, I would say the sheer number, in some cases, of police that were called, right? So there were times, and Columbia was one of the cases where they chose not just to call police, but that there was a very large number that descend on campus. And I think that certainly those images stay in our mind, and they've definitely fed into this year. And we also know that wasn't all campuses, right? But those are the ones that, the media kind of pulled out for us. And so the interesting thing, and the wonderful thing, and interesting and sometimes hard thing about higher ed, is the fact that each campus is unique, right? There's different ways in which they played out in campuses for a whole host of reasons. I would say, from work they did before, where they were situated, the politics of the and dynamics of their communities. So it's hard to say, like, we don't want to paint too broad a picture of when police were called or not, but I would definitely say that it added to a cultural feeling, right? A sense for many, even if it wasn't on your campus, that now this is happening, it's prevalent, and fear. And I think I know we're going to get into part 2 in a little bit, but that fear and anxiety that went into this school year, that has actually, I'd say, has just skyrocketed now in the last few months, is kind of, that's been just pervasive, and unfortunately continues for now other reasons. But I think that was seeded last year with a lot of those, like you said, the images we saw, whether it was on your campus or not.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. And I do want to, Mary Rose, come to you with a question, and then kind of use that to kind of get into our into the more present day, the current moment, in terms of talking about the state of free speech. One sort of issue that is relevant to our conversation today, that folks in this room have probably been hearing a lot more of, is Title VI. It is the civil rights law, the federal civil rights law that bars discrimination based on race, color, and national origin in education, including shared ancestry. So, for example, Jewish identity, Muslim identity. It sort of is a very important civil rights law. We are seeing it being used to hold colleges accountable for the ways that they're responding to both protests and the ways that they're responding to concerns, especially from Jewish students, about those protests and the speech at those protests. So, Mary Rose, I'm curious, again, as a legal expert in the room, what are sort of the early signs we're seeing of like the role that Title VI is playing in the current campus free speech landscapes? Or what have you seen so far?
Well, it's playing a huge role. I guess I'd like to move back to before Trump became president, because Title VI was playing a big role then as well, just a little bit different. The universities have had to worry about Title VI and Title IX. Title IX is more about sex discrimination, but they've had to worry about not being deliberately indifferent to discrimination based on these protected characteristics. And so it's not that these federal laws set up strict liability for a school if students protest, and that's creating a hostile environment, that the universities therefore violated the law. So I just want to make that clear. There has to be a showing of deliberate indifference. And so even before Trump came in, I just want to clarify, like, universities were very worried about Title VI even before violations of Title VI were alleged to withhold federal funding, like a gun to the head situation, which we're now seeing. But even before this time, we've had many conversations and coming from Office of Civil Rights, some direction of like, it is possible to enforce Title VI and honor the First Amendment principles, which, by the way, both private universities and public universities, most of them anyway, try to comply, either because they have to or because they want to, with general free speech principles. But there's an obvious tension when you have political protest that is itself asserted to create a hostile environment. And this is something that we haven't seen universities have to deal with on such a scale, where you have the protesters saying we're engaging in core political speech, and you have some students and faculty and staff saying that the protests are making them feel unsafe, unwelcome, and in some cases, unable to even like get into the buildings. I think Miguel and Kristen, we're talking about, like, there are limits even for protests, just regardless of Title VI, like you can't occupy the buildings and prevent the students from entering. So this has been a big issue and an unresolved issue, like this tension between the First Amendment and Title VI. We saw the heads of the presidents of some top universities roll because they didn't give satisfactory answers to Congress, asking about, what are you going to do if a student, calls for genocide? And they say it depends. Well, it does actually under the First Amendment, but that didn't really sit well. It didn't come across very well. So that was the sort of the before. And I will highlight that in addition to the threats that the Trump administration is now, using Title VI to say that it's going to withhold funding unless universities do X, Y, and Z. We also have a whole bunch of lawsuits brought by students, mostly students, alleging that universities violated Title VI. And we're seeing very mixed results. It's still early, but this just illustrates that universities are not strictly liable. So just for example, Harvard, a lawsuit against Harvard has survived a motion to dismiss. So some students sued up there. That lawsuit is continuing. One interesting thing I want to highlight about that lawsuit is that the district court judge said, I'm not going to actually decide right now that Harvard can assert the First Amendment as a limit on its ability to restrict protests, which I found fascinating. Of course, Harvard is a private actor, and that's what the judge was highlighting. They're a private actor. Maybe they want to follow the First Amendment, but they don't have to. I'm just that's a little footnote that I think we should be thinking a lot more about. But up in Boston, we see MIT successfully winning a motion to dismiss a Title VI case brought against it. So, Title VI can be used both by the Office of Civil Rights and these other federal agencies as a leverage on the funding. But it also does provide, the court has said that these statutes provide a private cause of action, and we do see a number of these lawsuits pending and still very much unresolved.
Thanks so much, Mary Rose. And as we get into our last, 15 minutes here, I do want to, talk about sort of the current the current administration, the current moment, basically 2025, what campus speech has what's been happening with campus speech in this moment. Kristen, I wonder if you can give us a brief overview. Again, you're looking across the country at campus expression. What are you seeing? What are you concerned about as we come under an administration that frankly has shown that it's not afraid to use federal authority to try to pressure institutions to do to align with their agenda?
Yeah. Yeah, I was looking back a little just from January on because it feels so long ago. As I was preparing, and I remembered early on, just a few weeks in, we had responded because there was kind of a grouping of situations where happened where some various programs, activities that would fall kind of generally under DEI were canceled at a few different campuses. So we saw a panel conversation in one place that was going to be about a race forum. We saw at another place an LGBTQ healthcare that was part of a medical university was canceled. And so we saw these pop-ups that happened initially, and they, even in the reporting, were really in response to the executive orders on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and on gender, kind of the scrubbing of that word. And so we saw that sort of early capitulation. That might not have really been even legally necessary, but kind of an early, we better fold these or we better stop these programs. And then, it feels quickly after that, we've gotten to where we are now with the funding, the threats of funding, the pulling away, and I'm sure we'll get into some more of the details, but I'll say, and then of course the students, right, who have been detained and held. And so when, again, I brought up the weird fear and anxiety, and I really feel like that pretty much is what I'm hearing from people when I talk to a lot of people across campuses. I'm hearing a lot of people kind of pulling in, and when it comes to speech specifically, so it's what we're talking about, that fear, and the risks are so high for so many people individually, right? I think it's really worth noting that we're in this moment where it's not about just, oh, use your voice, you have the right to free speech, or you have the right, to do this on campus or to protest or anything, regardless of policies, regardless of anything else, that I think a lot of campuses are rightly working with their students and their faculty and their staff to say, hey, you might need to take, let's assess what risks you're willing to take that you can take. Make sure you know your rights in this moment. And on one hand, I think this is wonderful that campuses are providing these services and necessary, and it's also, just really speaks to the state that we're in, right? That these are really necessary on campus. I read at one point that, when it comes to things like student press or other things, that some students are being told to be careful about what you report on. Again, it's an awful thing to have to say, and also the risks are really high. So it's a really tough equation right now that people are dealing with on a quite individual basis.
Yeah, I want to linger on something you brought up, which is the diversity, equity, and inclusion issue, the DEI. And I think we have seen the Trump administration say, we believe that much of DEI, programs, activities, offices, we believe it is illegal racial discrimination, and it treats students differently based on their race. And that is the approach that they are taking, which has scared a lot of institutions into preemptive compliance, like Kristen was talking about. This doesn't just play out in sort of offices, administrative offices, programs, et cetera, right? I mean, Mary Rose, I'm curious what you've seen with when we're talking about the curriculum, because, right, like the federal government is not supposed to have the ability to influence the curriculum. But when we're thinking about, people talking about they're concerned about a chilling effect, that must reverberate into the classroom, right? So what have you seen there?
Well, yes. So the concern is largely based on a threat of withdrawal of federal funding. So you see the universities really freaking out. That's speaking casually, like really, I mean, I would be if I were university president. You know, it is as I mentioned earlier, existential threat to the major research universities to lose. You know, like Cornell threatened now with $1 billion dollars in funding, Harvard $9 billion. Like, it's not possible to recoup that through fundraising. So this is a real problem, and so that's why I think you see the leadership of the universities in some places preemptively acting. And so here at UNC, for example, the system office sent out guidance that all mandatory curriculum requirements, DEI curriculum requirements, so not all classes, there has been no major like elimination of all classes that might touch on DEI topics, but required classes for the general education curriculum, or required classes for any particular major that focused on diversity, that those would no longer be required classes. And that is something the system office did without going through the usual faculty governance channels. This was more of a unilateral action. I know that here at the law school, here at UNC, I know some students have been worried that that we will be scrubbing our syllabi and our courses. That has not happened. There has been no direction on that level to get rid of these classes or to stop teaching these concepts. But that it is on the required level. And I think that this is the system office working preemptively, hoping to avoid the stripping of federal funding. Now, you're going to see different, in different states, different reaction. I think Florida and Texas much more proactively trying to eliminate DEI from the curriculum. We have ongoing litigation in Florida about the anti-woke legislation in that state, still unresolved. So, you know, I expect we'll see more, especially the red and purple states, either preemptively or in response to a demand from the administration. We haven't seen a ton of express demands to change the curriculum, but it could be part of the conditions that that the Trump administration asserts in order to preserve the funding. There might be some additional requirements on the curriculum or restrictions on what is taught, or, you know, as we saw up at Columbia, putting the Middle Eastern Studies Department into receivership. You know, it is possible to see more of that.
Yeah, and I want to, you know, address as well, like how college leaders are kind of responding publicly, right? I mean, I think, you know, we've seen, as we've talked about here, like some preemptive compliance to try to, you know, like we're trying not to get targeted by the Trump administration. We're trying to sort of keep the target off of our back. Kristen, I'm curious, you know, what you're seeing in terms of how college leaders are responding in this moment. Do you think that they're doing enough to stand up for, you know, frankly, in many cases, like these are First Amendment issues. I mean, are they doing enough to stand up for those principles in light of this pressure they're facing from the government?
I mean, look, I think similar to what Mary Rose said, I'm not in the rooms and I wouldn't want to be, right? It's a really hard thing that they are navigating right now. I will acknowledge that. I have the benefit of not being in the room, though, and not being a president. So I can say that wholeheartedly, no, I don't think there's been enough. We all have probably can say, you know, we talk about Michael Roth, the president of Wesleyan, Chris Gruber, the president of Princeton, as two examples of presidents who have been willing to speak out, to push back. Just yesterday, Chris Gruber was on the Daily, and he talked about, no, we are not going to fold, right? And so I think hearing those is really heartening. I think it's two cases, and you know, there's probably multiple reasons why they're able to speak out, and others maybe can't. But I would definitely say any work we can do across the sector to bolster, to help infuse this sense that we really need to push back, to hold on to the values of higher education, which include freedom of expression and academic freedom, and as well as the fiduciary concerns, right, that boards have, that they have to be working together as they're really thinking of how to uphold the mission of higher education. And I really would say, I mean, it is gravely at risk right now, right? And I think we know that. And I've heard quite a lot of, you know, both presidents and faculty and others who write about these issues say that just, you know, this capitulation, right? This saying, okay, we will acquiesce to these demands. It doesn't even mean the funding comes back. And in many cases, it appears to be, they just go after another school and the next school and the next school. And so I think we need to really think about where we're going to be able to create some of this ability to speak back, to resist, to, you know, and to really help bring that into a broader movement.
I want to, understanding that, we're getting to the end of our time here, Miguel, I want to make sure that we go to you and talk about, you're on the ground, you are experiencing a campus in this moment, you're interacting with students, you're interacting with a lot of students from vulnerable communities right now. How are you thinking about, again, in a moment where the federal government has been, yes, going after people, international students especially, who have protested the war in Gaza, they're also going after international students and undocumented students who did not protest. They're going after for unclear reasons. How are you thinking about communicating with students, support for vulnerable communities in this moment? What is that like on your campus?
Absolutely. I think it is critical for us to do what we are known for doing in student affairs, which is to really ground ourselves in a culture of care. And so for us, culture of care is making sure that our centers and our staffs, our departments are up to date on what is happening, that we are holding on to accurate information and we're not sharing truths or misunderstandings or rumors. I will say that in this moment of uncertainty, the managing of rumors is really critical, so that we do not add to the anxiety, the fear, or the concerns that our community members have, students, faculty, staff, all of us, right? And so I think some of the things that we are doing that I think will help us is connecting. Again, this goes back similar to my last comments around connecting with community and collaboration. We're not approaching this as an island at San Francisco State. We are really connecting with our system-wide offices, similar to what Mayor Rose mentioned. We are part of a system. We are in communication with other systems in the state and in promising practices that we're witnessing and hearing about. For us, some of the things that looks like is that we have single points of contact that all of us are aware of, so that if a student, a staff member, a community member is concerned, we are not giving outdated information. It does feel like information is coming at a very fast pace. And so it is important for us to have a single point of contact. And for us, in talking about it, international students, it is our Office of International Programs. With that said, some of the things that, as Dean of Students and Associate Vice President for a division, our team is very well connected to our Office of International Programs to support, to help, to uplift, to encourage, to redirect community members in that space. And it is not an environment where, similar to when we're talking about activism or responding to protests, that we're doing it in isolation. We support each other across campus in getting the message out and really taking care of each other during this time, and making sure that our students know that we collectively are here to help. And so for us, the things that having our response with the best information we have, we funnel it through our through one center, through one team, and we seek their guidance in what is promising practice in this area. So I hope that helps a little bit. And similarly for our undocumented students and our documented students, we are engaging in that way of making sure that we stay informed on what is promising best practice, what's current information, and making sure that we don't add to fear and rumors that show up in community.
Thanks so much, Miguel. And thanks to, all three of our panelists today for a really wide-ranging and interesting discussion. There are a few really good questions in the Q&A that we couldn't get to, but I would encourage those folks to reach out to people offline. There were a couple of questions for Miguel, for example. Please do reach out offline and engage further on these really important speech issues. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to close us out.
Thank you so much to Mary Rose and Miguel and Kristen, and to our fabulous moderator, Sarah. The time went by so quickly. So I am glad that you already urged people to be connected with these amazing folks in different areas of expertise. I'm grateful to all of you for your insights and time. I hope that overall people found today to be as inspiring and illuminating as I have, and that you'll take what you learned into your day-to-day work and partnerships, including that feeling of community and collective support. I want to thank the amazing center team, Brenda Pitcher, Melanie Zement, and Kristen Gonzalez for all they do to ensure the success of the center. I want to give a special shout out to the Glen Echo Group, who's been a partner in so much of what the center has done these past 7 years, including all of our Speech Matters conferences. And of course, I want to thank all the attendees for joining and participating. Join our mailing list, continue to engage with us and each other. Please support our work. Over the summer, you can look forward to receiving our fellows' final projects and research. We'll be hosting our fellows in the field workshops. In the meantime, we'll be podcasting and thinking about how we can work together to safeguard speech, engagement, our institutions, and democracy. With that, I'm going to sign off from Truth, Trust, and Transformation 2025. Thank you so much.